I sat at the back table of the Grand Plaza ballroom, wearing a 5-year-old dress while my family celebrated my sister's success, the company I built with my dying father's last savings. My mother introduced my sister as our pride and joy, the brilliant entrepreneur. No one mentioned my name. No one remembered I existed. Until a silver-haired investor stood up in the middle of the champagne toast, stared directly at me and asked the question that shattered everything. Wait, aren't you the founder? The room went dead silent. My mother's wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble floor. My sister's face went white, and I realised, after 5 years of being erased, humiliated, and told I was nothing, someone finally saw me. What happened next wasn't just about reclaiming a stolen company. It was about discovering that my father had left me a weapon even he didn't tell my family about. And by the time I was done, the people who buried me alive would beg for mercy they'd never shown me. This is the story of how I rose from the ashes and made them all remember my name. My name is Stephanie Cooper. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 5 years, I've worked at a small nonprofit in Oregon, helping senior citizens navigate technology, a job that pays barely enough to cover rent in a studio apartment I share with a cat named Widget. It wasn't always this way. Once I had a dream big enough to change the world. But dreams, I learned, are fragile things when the people you trust most decide to take them for themselves. Tonight, I was back in Boston for the first time in years, standing in the gilded ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and people in designer gowns who looked right through me like I was invisible. This was Silver Connect's 5th anniversary gala, a celebration of the company I'd founded with my dying father's last $15,000. Except no one here knew that, or if they did, they'd decided to forget. I sat at table 18, tucked in the back corner near the kitchen doors, where the catering staff rushed in and out with trays of champagne. My mother had insisted I attend. "It's a family event," she'd said on the phone, her voice tight with that particular blend of guilt and obligation she wielded like a weapon. So I'd flown across the country, dug out my only decent dress, a simple navy blue sheath I'd bought for a job interview half a decade ago, and showed up telling myself it was just one night. I could survive one night. The ballroom was packed with 200 guests, all of them here to celebrate my sister Melissa and her husband Derek Walsh, the so-called visionary founders of Silver Connect Solutions. I watched them glide across the room, shaking hands and posing for photos, Melissa radiant in a white silk gown that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. She looked happy, successful, everything I was supposed to be. My mother stood at the microphone near the head table, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her smile brilliant as she raised a champagne flute. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying across the room with practiced ease. "Tonight, we celebrate not just a company, but a dream realized. My daughter, Melissa, and her brilliant husband, Derek, have built something extraordinary. They are living proof that with vision, determination, and the courage to take risks, anything is possible." The room erupted in applause. I stared down at my water glass, my throat tight. "Of course," my mother continued, and I felt my stomach drop because I knew what was coming. "Not everyone in the family has that kind of drive. My older daughter tried her hand at business once, but, well, it didn't work out. These things aren't for everyone." She smiled indulgently, as if failure were a quirky personality trait I'd been born with. "But she's found her place now, doing wonderful work helping seniors. We're all very proud." A few people at nearby tables glanced back at me with that particular look, half pity, half curiosity, that made me want to disappear into the floor. Derek caught my eye from across the room and smirked, his arm draped possessively around Melissa's waist. He leaned over and whispered something in her ear. She didn't look at me. She never did anymore. I was contemplating whether I could slip out unnoticed when a man stood up at the head table. He was older, maybe 65, with silver hair and the kind of crisp-tailored suit that whispered old money. I didn't recognize him, but something about the way he was staring at me made my skin prickle with unease. He cleared his throat, and the room gradually quieted. "Forgive me," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation like a knife. "But I have to ask." He turned his gaze, locked directly on me, and my heart began to hammer against my ribs. "Aren't you Stephanie Cooper?" Every head in the room swiveled toward me. "Wait," he continued, his brow furrowing, as if he were solving a puzzle in real time. "You're the founder." The room went dead silent. I heard the sharp crack of my mother's champagne flute hitting the marble floor and shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. Derek's face drained of colour. Melissa's hand flew to her mouth. And I sat frozen in my chair at table 18, feeling 200 pairs of eyes boring into me like I was a ghost who'd just crashed her own funeral. Everyone stared at me like I was a ghost. My mother couldn't speak. I knew in that moment my life was about to change forever. The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. I could feel the weight of every gaze in that ballroom pressing down on me, suffocating and electric all at once. The man who'd spoken, the silver-haired investor, was still standing, still, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Curiosity, maybe. Or recognition. It was the recognition that terrified me most. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice gentler now, but no less commanding. "I don't mean to put you on the spot. It's just that I could have sworn I read an article about you years ago. Tech Innovators magazine, I think it was. You were featured as the founder of an app designed to help seniors stay connected with their families." He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to reconcile the woman in that article with the one sitting alone at the back of the room. "The technology was quite innovative. I remember thinking at the time that it was exactly the kind of solution the market needed." My mouth went dry. That article. I'd forgotten it even existed. It had been published 7 years ago, back when I was still full of hope and naive enough to believe that hard work and good intentions were enough to protect what you built. A journalist had interviewed me in the cramped studio apartment I'd been using as an office, and I'd talked for hours about my vision, about creating technology that didn't alienate the very people who needed it most. I'd shown her the prototype, explained the features, and she'd written a glowing piece that called me a rising star in senior tech innovation. That was before everything fell apart, before my mother's face twisted into something I didn't recognise. Derek leaned back in his chair with that infuriating smirk, clearly preparing to take control of the narrative. "Well, Mr. Morrison," he said smoothly, his tone dripping with condescension, "I think there's been a bit of confusion. Stephanie did have the initial idea, yes. She was very enthusiastic about it, as I'm sure you could tell from that article." He chuckled, a sound meant to be disarming, but that landed like a slap. "But ideas are just ideas, aren't they? The real work, the technical development, the business strategy, the execution, that all came later, after Melissa and I took over and turned it into something viable." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw heads nodding, people leaning toward each other to whisper. It was so easy for them to believe him. Derek had always been good at this, at spinning reality into whatever shape suited him best, at making lies sound like unfortunate misunderstandings. My mother found her voice then, though it wavered slightly. She bent down to pick up the shards of her broken champagne flute, her hand shaking just enough that I noticed. "Derek's right," she said, straightening up and forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Stephanie had a lovely concept, but she didn't have the skills to bring it to market. She's always been more of a dreamer. Melissa and Derek are the ones who made it a reality." She looked at me then, and there was something desperate in her gaze, something that looked almost like a plea. "Isn't that right, sweetheart?" Every instinct I had screamed at me to stand up, to shout the truth, to tell everyone in this room exactly what had happened. But I'd learned a long time ago that the truth didn't matter when the people holding the microphone were the ones rewriting history. So I did what I'd done for 5 years. I stayed silent. I sat in my chair at table 18 with my hands folded in my lap and my spine straight, and I said nothing. Silence, I discovered, had its own kind of dignity. They could lie about me, but they couldn't make me participate in my own erasure. Across the room, I saw Melissa's face. She wasn't looking at Derek or our mother or the silver-haired investor who'd started all of this. She was looking at me. And for just a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes, something that looked almost like fear, or maybe guilt. Her hand tightened on Derek's arm, her knuckles white, and then she looked away as if she couldn't bear to hold my gaze for another second. The investor, Mr. Morrison Derek had called him, didn't look convinced. His eyes moved from Derek to my mother to me, and I could see him processing, weighing their words against whatever he remembered from that article. "I see," he said slowly, though his tone suggested he didn't see at all. "Well, I suppose memory can be a tricky thing. It's been quite a few years." He sat back down, but he kept glancing at me, a small frown creasing his forehead. The party resumed its rhythm after that. Conversation started up again, laughter bubbled through the room, and the waiters circulated with more champagne. But something had shifted. People kept looking at me when they thought I wasn't paying attention, their expressions ranging from confusion to curiosity to something that might have been sympathy. I wanted to leave. I wanted to walk out of that ballroom and never look back. But I stayed because leaving would have felt like admitting defeat, and I'd already lost too much to give them the satisfaction of watching me run. As I sat there, my mind began to drift backward, pulled inexorably toward the past I'd spent 5 years trying to forget. To understand why I let them erase me, why I sat silently at table 18 while Derek and my mother rewrote my history, you'd have to know how it all began. You'd have to understand what I was before they took it away. 7 years ago, I had everything a dream, a father who believed in me and a bright future. Then my sister introduced me to the man who would steal it all. I was 29 years old when I decided to quit my teaching job. It wasn't a rash decision. I'd been mulling it over for months, lying awake at night, doing the math over and over in my head, trying to figure out if I could afford to take the leap. I'd been teaching high school English for 6 years, and while I loved my students, there was something else calling to me, something I couldn't ignore anymore. The idea had come to me during a parent-teacher conference. An elderly grandmother had shown up instead of the students' parents, and she'd spent 20 minutes struggling with the school's online portal, unable to access her granddaughter's grades. I'd watched her fumble with the mouse, her hands trembling with frustration, and something had clicked in my mind. Technology wasn't designed for people like her. It was designed for people who'd grown up with smartphones in their hands, who instinctively understood swipe gestures and drop-down menus. But what about the millions of seniors who wanted to stay connected with their families, who needed to manage their medications, who lived alone and might need help in an emergency? They deserved better. So I started designing an app. I worked on it every evening after school, every weekend, teaching myself to code through online tutorials and sheer stubborn determination. I called it Silver Connect, a platform that would strip away all the unnecessary complexity and give elderly users what they actually needed: big buttons, clear labels, voice commands, and most importantly, an emergency feature that could detect falls and automatically contact family members or emergency services. When I told my mother I was quitting my teaching job to pursue this full-time, she looked at me like I'd announced I was joining a cult. "You're throwing away a perfectly good career for what?" she'd said, her voice sharp with disapproval. "An app? Stephanie, do you have any idea how many people try to start tech companies and fail? You're a teacher, not an entrepreneur. You don't know the first thing about business." Melissa had been sitting at the kitchen table during that conversation, and she'd actually laughed at the idea. "God, Steph, you really think you're going to be the next Steve Jobs or something? You can barely figure out how to update your own phone." She'd shaken her head, her expression a mixture of amusement and pity. "This is going to be a disaster." But my father said nothing during that conversation. He just sat there in his favourite armchair, his face unreadable. It wasn't until later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, that he came to my room. He knocked softly on the door and stepped inside, moving slowly in the way he'd been moving for months, carefully, like his body hurt him in ways he didn't want us to know about. "I believe in you," he said simply. "I know they don't understand, but I do." I'd started crying then, and he'd sat on the edge of my bed and held my hand the way he had when I was a little girl. When I was your age, he told me I had dreams too. I wanted to open a bookstore after I got back from Vietnam, a place where people could come and talk about ideas, where veterans could find community. But I was too afraid. I let other people's voices drown out my own. He squeezed my hand. "Don't make my mistake, sweetheart. Do what's right, no matter what anyone says." 2 weeks later, he asked me to meet him at a coffee shop downtown. When I arrived, he was already there, a manila envelope sitting on the table between us. He slid it across to me without saying anything, and when I opened it, I found a check for $15,000 and a stack of legal documents I didn't fully understand. "What is this?" I'd asked, my hand shaking as I held the check. "Your first investor," he said. "I set up an LLC guardian angel, I called it. That's $10,000 for 5% equity. The documents say those shares can't be transferred without your signature. I wanted to make sure you were protected." He'd paused then, and something in his expression made my chest tighten. "The other 5,000 is in your mother's name. I had to do it that way for tax reasons. She doesn't know about it yet. But it's for you, both amounts, they're for you." I hadn't understood why he was being so secretive about it, why he'd structured the investment in such a specific way. I didn't know then what he knew, that he was dying, that the cancer the doctors thought they'd caught early had metastasized, spreading through his lungs and into his bones, that he had maybe 6 months left and he was spending those months making sure I'd have something to hold on to when he was gone. He made me promise not to tell my mother. "She'll worry," he'd said, "and she'll try to talk you out of it. Let's keep this between us for now." I'd thrown my arms around him and promised I'd make him proud. I'd promised I'd build something that mattered, something that would help people. He'd smiled at me, that gentle, knowing smile of his, and told me he had no doubt. He died 6 months later on a Tuesday morning in March. The cancer moved fast at the end, faster than any of us expected. 1 week, he was sitting up in bed, talking about baseball, and the next, he was gone. At his funeral, I'd stood by his casket, holding a small framed photo of the two of us, taken the day I'd shown him the first working prototype of Silver Connect. In the picture, he was smiling with the tears in his eyes, and I was grinning, like I'd just won the lottery. I'd pressed my hand against the smooth wood of the casket and whispered, "I'll make you proud, Dad. I promise. I'll finish what we started." Then my sister and her boyfriend appeared at my elbow, Melissa's hand tucked into the crook of Derek's arm, both of them wearing appropriately somber expressions. Derek extended his hand to shake mine, his grip firm and professional. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he'd said. "Your father sounded like an amazing man." I had no idea then that I was shaking hands with the person who would take everything my father had given me and claim it as his own. Derek started coming around more often after the funeral. At first, I thought he was just being supportive of Melissa, helping her cope with losing our father. But then he started asking me about Silver Connect casual questions, at first innocent enough. How was development going? Had I thought about my go-to-market strategy? Did I have a pitch deck prepared for investors? I was grateful for the interest, honestly. My mother had retreated into her grief, barely speaking to anyone, and Melissa seemed more focused on wedding planning than on acknowledging that our father was gone. Derek was the only one who asked about the work, the only one who seemed to understand that finishing Silver Connect wasn't just a business goal for me, it was a promise I'd made to my father. 3 months after the funeral, Derek suggested we meet for coffee. He showed up with a leather portfolio and a smile that I would later recognise as predatory, but that I interpreted then as friendly confidence. "I've been thinking," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "You've got an incredible product here, but you need help taking it to the next level. I work in marketing, as you know, and I've got connections in the tech investment world. What if I helped you find investors? You focus on the product, and I'll focus on the business side." It sounded like a gift from heaven. I was exhausted from trying to do everything myself. Coding, testing, marketing, service marketing, business development, all while working part-time at a tutoring centre to pay my bills. The idea of having someone else handle the investor relations was almost too good to be true. I should have known it was. Over the next few months, Derek became deeply involved in Silver Connect. He asked for access to the source code so he could show it to potential investors. He wanted copies of the user database from the beta testing phase so he could help with the marketing strategy. He needed to see all the financial projections, the business plans, the intellectual property documentation. I gave him everything. He was going to marry my sister. He was family. Why wouldn't I trust him? 4 months later, I received a certified letter from a law firm I'd never heard of. Inside was a cease and desist order. Derek Walsh and Melissa Cooper had filed incorporation papers for a new company called Silver Connect Solutions, using code and data that belonged to me. My name appeared nowhere on the documents. According to the filing, they were the co-founders. I was nothing. I'd driven to my mother's house in a blind rage, the letter crumpled in my fist. I'd barged in without knocking and found Derek sitting at the kitchen table, with my mother looking calm and collected while she sat across from him with tears streaming down her face. "What the hell is this?" I'd shouted, slamming the letter down on the table. Derek had leaned back in his chair completely unruffled. "It's a business decision, Stephanie. Nothing personal." Nothing personal. I could barely breathe. "You stole my company. You stole my father's investment. You stole everything I've been working on for 3 years." "I didn't steal anything," he'd said smoothly. "I built a company using the foundation you provided. There's a difference. And if you try to fight me on this, things are going to get very ugly for your family." That's when my mother spoke, her voice small and broken. "Stephanie, please, just let it go." I'd stared at her in disbelief. "Let it go, Mom. He stole from me. From us. Dad's money is in this company." Derek's expression had hardened then. "About that money," he said. "Did you know your mother withdrew funds from her retirement account early to help pay for your father's cancer treatment? She didn't report it correctly on her taxes. That's tax evasion, Stephanie. The IRS takes that very seriously. She could face substantial fines or even prison time." He'd paused, letting that sink in. Of course, I'd hate to see that happen, especially now when she's already dealing with so much grief. The room had tilted. I'd looked at my mother, waiting for her to deny it, to tell me he was lying, but she'd just covered her face with her hands and sobbed. "Here's what's going to happen," Derek had continued. "You're going to sign a cooperation agreement acknowledging that you contributed to the initial concept of Silver Connect, but that Melissa and I developed it into a viable business. You're going to walk away quietly. And in exchange, I'll make sure your mother's tax issues disappear. I've already paid off what she owes. But if you fight me..." He'd shrugged. "Well, let's just say I have very detailed records of every financial irregularity." I'd looked at my mother, really looked at her and seen how small she'd become, how frightened. She was 63 years old, barely holding herself together after losing her husband. The thought of her facing legal consequences, of her losing everything, was unbearable. "Melissa's pregnant," my mother had whispered. "She needs this marriage. She needs stability. Please, Stephanie, please don't destroy this family." So I'd signed. Not because I believed Derek's lies, not because I thought it was right, but because the alternative was watching my mother go to prison and my sister lose everything. The cooperation agreement was vague and poorly worded. It didn't explicitly transfer my rights, but it was enough for Derek to claim I'd acknowledged his version of events. enough to muddy the waters if I tried to fight back later. I'd walked out of the lawyer's office that day feeling like I'd been hollowed out, like everything essential to who I was had been scooped away and discarded. I climbed into my car, turned the key in the ignition, and sat there staring at nothing for what felt like hours. When I finally started driving, I made it 3 blocks before I had to pull over because I couldn't see through the tears. I'd pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, and that's when I felt my father's watch sliding off my wrist. I'd been wearing it every day since the funeral, but I'd lost so much weight from stress that it no longer fit properly. It fell between my legs and bounced onto the floor mat. When I picked it up and stepped out onto the sidewalk, it slipped from my shaking fingers and hit the concrete with a sharp crack. The crystal face shattered into a spider web of fractures. The hands froze at 3:47 p.m., just like my life. The rumours started spreading through Boston's tech community within weeks. Stephanie Cooper had failed. She'd been incompetent, unable to execute on her own vision. That's why her sister and brother-in-law had to step in and salvage what little value remained in her amateur project. I heard it third-hand from a former colleague, someone who'd worked with me during my beta testing phase. She'd called to ask if I was okay, her voice careful and pitying, in a way that made me want to throw my phone across the room. I wasn't okay. I was drowning. My savings evaporated within 3 months. The studio apartment I'd been renting became unaffordable. I moved into a cheaper place, then a cheaper one after that, each step down feeling like another piece of my dignity slipping away. I stopped answering my mother's phone calls. I couldn't bear to hear her voice, to be reminded of how she'd chosen Melissa's comfort over my entire future. I didn't go to Melissa's wedding. I didn't even send a card. By the time I turned 30, I'd left Boston entirely. I couldn't stay in a city where everyone knew me as the woman who'd failed, where I might run into Derek and Melissa at any coffee shop or networking event. So I packed what little I owned into my 12-year-old Honda and drove west until I found a town small enough that no one would know my story. Wilson Creek, Oregon was barely a dot on the map population. 8001 Main Street, surrounded by pine forests, and the kind of quiet that felt almost oppressive after years of city living. I rented a room in a house owned by a retired postal worker named Betty, and I took the first job I could find night shift at Sunset Gardens Senior Living Center. $12 an hour, no benefits. It wasn't what I'd imagined for myself, but it was something. And after months of feeling like I was disappearing, even something felt like a small miracle. The work was hard, physically exhausting, and emotionally draining. I helped residents to the bathroom, changed bed sheets, administered medications, listened to the same stories told over and over by people whose memories were starting to slip away. But there was something oddly comforting about it too. These people didn't know who I was supposed to have been. They didn't care that I'd once been featured in Tech Innovators magazine. To them, I was just the kind night nurse who made sure they had warm blankets and someone to talk to when they couldn't sleep. Agnes Chen was one of my regulars. She was 82, sharp as a tack, and had a wicked sense of humour that made the night shifts pass faster. She'd been a pianist in her younger years, and sometimes she'd tell me stories about performing in concert halls across Europe, her gnarled fingers moving through the air as if she were still playing invisible keys. I found her on a Tuesday night in March, collapsed on the floor of her room, her face slack on one side and her words coming out garbled and wrong. I knew immediately what I was looking at. Stroke. I hit the call button and dropped to my knees beside her, taking her hand and telling her to hold on, that help was coming, that she was going to be okay, even though I had no idea if that was true. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes. I rode with her to the hospital because there was no one else. Her emergency contact was a son who lived in Boston, and it was 3 a.m. on the West Coast. I sat in the ER waiting room still wearing my scrubs, and when they finally let me back to see her, I pulled a chair up next to her bed and stayed. The nurses tried to send me home when my shift ended, but I couldn't leave her alone, so I stayed through the morning, through the afternoon, through another evening dozing in that uncomfortable plastic chair and waking every time a monitor beeped. Her son arrived 14 hours after I'd found her. Marcus Chen was a tall man in his late 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of exhausted, terrified expression that comes from taking red-eye flights across the country to reach your mother's hospital bed. When he walked into the room and saw me sitting there holding his mother's hand, his face crumpled. "You stayed with her," he said, his voice breaking. "The whole time. You stayed." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just squeezed Agnes's hand gently and stood up to give him space. "She's going to be okay," I told him. "The doctors said she got here in time. You've got a tough mum." He'd pulled me into a hug right there in the hospital room, this stranger holding on to me like I'd saved the world. "Thank you," he kept saying. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." Agnes recovered over the following weeks, regaining most of her speech and mobility. Before she was discharged back to Sunset Gardens, Marcus came to visit me during one of my shifts. He pressed a business card into my hand. Marcus Chen, attorney at law, specializing in intellectual property and corporate litigation, and told me that if I ever needed anything at all, I should call him. "My mother said you're the kindest person she's ever met," he said. "The world needs more people like you." I'd tucked the card into my wallet and forgotten about it. What would I ever need a corporate lawyer for? That part of my life was over. 8 months later, on my 35th birthday, I received an email. The subject line read, "Staff Restructuring Notice." The sender was a corporate address I didn't recognize at first until I saw the logo at the bottom of the email, the same logo I designed 7 years ago, now polished and professional and stamped with the name Silver Connect Solutions. The email was brief and clinical. Due to recent corporate acquisitions, Sunset Gardens Senior Living Centre was now under new management. As part of organisational restructuring, several positions were being eliminated. My employment was terminated effective immediately. They thanked me for my service. I read it 3 times before the reality sank in. They'd bought the place where I worked, and now they were firing me. On my birthday, I sat on the edge of my bed in Betty's house that night with all the lights off, holding my father's broken watch in my hands. The watch I'd kept even though it no longer worked, even though the shattered crystal cut my fingers when I held it too tight. I pressed it against my chest and whispered into the darkness, "Dad, have I truly lost everything?" The silence that answered felt absolute. I didn't know then that this darkest moment would begin my resurrection. But sitting at table 18 in the Grand Plaza ballroom, watching the silver-haired investor weave his way through the crowd toward me, I felt something shift, something small and fragile like the first crack in a frozen lake. The party had resumed its rhythm around us, but the energy had changed. People were whispering behind their champagne flutes, stealing glances at me when they thought I wasn't looking. My mother had disappeared somewhere, probably to the bathroom to compose herself. Derek was huddled in the corner with Melissa speaking to her in urgent, hushed tones, and Richard Morrison was getting closer, his expression determined and kind in equal measure. When he reached my table, he extended his hand. "Richard Morrison," he said, as if we were meeting for the first time in a normal context, as if he hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of my family's carefully constructed lie. "I'm sorry to have put you on the spot like that. I wonder if you'd be willing to step outside with me for a moment. I think we need to talk." Every instinct told me to say no, to protect myself, to avoid whatever was coming next. But there was something in his eyes, a steadiness, a sincerity that made me trust him despite my better judgment. I nodded and stood my legs unsteady beneath me and followed him through the ballroom toward the doors that led to the rooftop terrace. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and clean, after the stifling heat of the crowded ballroom. The terrace overlooked Boston Harbor, the city lights reflecting off the black water in shimmering streaks. Richard walked to the railing and leaned against it, his shoulders relaxing as if he too had been suffocating inside. "I knew your father," he said without preamble, his voice quiet but firm. "David Cooper. That is correct, isn't it?" My breath caught. I hadn't heard anyone speak my father's name with that kind of reverence in years. "Yes," I managed. "How did you—" "Vietnam," he said simply. 1968. We were in the same unit during the siege of Khe Sanh. He turned to look at me then, and I saw something raw in his expression. Grief, maybe, or guilt. "Your father saved my life. We were pinned down during a mortar attack, and I was hit in the leg, couldn't move. David ran into the open, ran through incoming fire, and dragged me to cover. He took shrapnel in his shoulder doing it. Could have been killed." I pressed my hand against the railing to steady myself. My father had never talked much about the war. I knew he'd served, knew he'd come home with scars both visible and invisible, but he'd never told me stories like this. "We lost touch after we came home," Richard continued. "I went to college on the GI Bill, built a career in investment banking. I always meant to find him, to thank him properly, but life got in the way. And then—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "When I was approached to invest in Silver Connect Solutions 3 years ago, I did my due diligence. I always do. I looked at the company's history, the founding documents, the early press, and I found an article from 7 years ago in Tech Innovators magazine featuring a woman named Stephanie Cooper, David Cooper's daughter, as the founder of an innovative senior care technology platform. My heart was hammering now. "You knew. All this time, you knew." "I suspected something was wrong," he corrected. "The company's official founding story didn't match the earliest documentation I could find. Your name appeared in preliminary filings, then vanished. It seemed odd, but I didn't have proof of wrongdoing, just discrepancies. So I started digging deeper." He pulled out his phone and opened a photo, turning the screen toward me. It was an old picture, faded and creased, 2 young men in military fatigues, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera despite the exhaustion in their eyes. One of them was unmistakably my father, decades younger, but with the same warm smile. "I kept this picture all these years, and when I saw you tonight, when you smiled at something someone said, I recognized that smile, your father's smile. I knew it was you." Tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't bother to wipe them away. "Why didn't you say something sooner? Why invest in the company if you knew?" "Because I didn't know the full story," he said gently. "I suspected theft, but I didn't have evidence, and I wanted to understand what had happened before I acted. So I invested, and I watched. I saw how Derek operates, how Melissa defers to him, how they talk about the early days of the company in vague, inconsistent terms. And tonight, seeing you sitting alone at the back of the room while they celebrated," his voice hardened. I couldn't stay silent anymore. "They'll deny everything," I said, my voice breaking. "They have lawyers' documentation, a story they've been telling for 5 years. I signed a paper, not a transfer, but enough that they can claim I agreed to their version of events. What can I possibly do against that?" Richard straightened up, and there was steel in his posture, now the bearing of a man who'd survived war and built an empire and wasn't about to be intimidated by people like Derek Walsh. "You can fight," he said, "with my help. I owe your father a debt I can never repay, but I can do this. I can help you reclaim what's yours, for David's honor, if nothing else." He paused, his eyes searching mine. "If you're willing to fight?" I thought about my father's last words to me, his insistence that I do what was right no matter what anyone said. I thought about the $15,000 he'd scraped together in his final months, his desperate attempt to give me a foundation that couldn't be taken away. I thought about 5 years of silence, of shame, of letting Derek and Melissa erase me from my own story. "I'm willing," I whispered. Richard smiled, a fierce, determined smile that reminded me so much of my father it hurt. "Good. Then let's get started." For the first time in 5 years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten how to feel. Not alone. Someone believed me. Someone was willing to fight beside me. But even as relief flooded through me, fear came with it, cold and sharp and unavoidable. If I did this, if I really fought back, there would be consequences. My mother would be caught in the middle. Melissa would lose everything. The fragile remnants of our family would shatter completely. Would I lose my mother and sister forever? The question hung in the air between us, heavy and unavoidable. Richard was watching me carefully, giving me space to think, and I was grateful for that. My mind was racing through scenarios, each one worse than the last. If I fought back, Melissa would lose the company, the house, the lifestyle she'd built. My mother would be devastated. She'd already lost my father, and now she'd lose the illusion that our family was intact. And me, I'd become the villain in their story, the bitter woman who couldn't let go, who destroyed her own family out of spite. But if I stayed silent, nothing would change. Derek would keep the company my father had helped me build. Melissa would keep pretending she'd earned something she'd stolen. And I would keep working minimum wage jobs in towns where nobody knew my name, carrying the weight of my own erasure until it crushed me completely. What exactly are you proposing? I finally asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Richard straightened, and I could see the businessman in him emerging, sharp, strategic, ready to act. Full legal and financial support. I'll hire the best intellectual property attorneys in Boston. We'll file suit to establish your rightful ownership of the Silver Connect technology and reclaim what was stolen. We'll go after damages for lost income for the fraudulent use of your father's investment for everything. He paused. It won't be easy and it won't be quick, but we can win this. And my mother, I asked quietly. Derek's leveraged the tax issues. We'll handle it. I have accountants, tax attorneys. If your mother made honest mistakes while dealing with her husband's terminal illness, any reasonable prosecutor would show leniency. Derek's been using the threat to control you, but threats only work if you believe them. His expression softened slightly. I won't let your mother go to prison, Stephanie. You have my word. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly. But 5 years of defeat had taught me to expect the worst. Derek has lawyers too, good ones, and he's had 5 years to build his version of the story. He'll say, I was incompetent, that I couldn't execute, that he and Melissa saved the company from my mismanagement. People will believe him because that's what people do. They believe the person who's already winning. Let them, Richard said, and there was something fierce in his voice now. Let Derek tell his story. We'll tell yours, with evidence, documentation, witnesses, your father's investment records, the early prototypes, the Tech Innovators article, everything that proves you were the founder, the creator, the vision behind Silver Connect. He leaned forward slightly. You're not fighting from a position of weakness anymore, Stephanie. You're fighting from truth. And truth is a hell of a lot stronger than Derek Walsh's lies. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was 29 again, sitting on my father's hospital bed 3 days before he died. He'd been so thin by then, his skin papery and grey, but his eyes had still held that spark of conviction that made him who he was. Do what's right, no matter what anyone says, he told me, even if it costs you, especially if it costs you, because at the end of your life, the only thing that matters is whether you can look yourself in the mirror. I'd failed him. For 5 years, I'd let Derek and Melissa take everything he'd given me and claim it as their own. I'd stayed silent to protect people who hadn't protected me. I'd made myself small and invisible and insignificant because it was easier than fighting, but my father hadn't raised me to take the easy path. I'll do it, I said, opening my eyes. I'll fight back. Relief flooded Richard's face. Good. We'll start tomorrow. I'll put you in touch with... But not like this, I interrupted. Not with lawsuits and press conferences and public warfare. That's Derek's way, and I won't become him just to beat him. Richard frowned slightly. I'm not sure I follow. I need to rebuild first. I said, the idea crystallizing even as I spoke it. Before I can prove I'm the rightful founder, I need to prove I'm still capable of founding something. I need to show that the vision was mine, that the innovation was mine, that I didn't need Derek or Melissa to make Silver Connect work. They needed me. I straightened my shoulders. I'm going to create a new version of the app. Better than what they're selling. Better than what I originally designed. I'm going to launch it, and I'm going to prove that the technology, the understanding of what seniors need, the entire concept, all of it came from me. That could take months, Richard said. Maybe longer. I know, but when we walk into that courtroom, I want there to be no doubt about who the innovator is. I want the judge to see two companies side by side and know immediately which one has the soul of the founder and which one is just a hollow imitation. I met his eyes. I'll do this my way. No noise, no revenge, just truth. And I'll let my work speak for itself. Richard studied me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. Your father would be proud of you. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I had to look away to keep from breaking down completely. I hope so, I whispered. I know so, Richard said firmly, and I'll support you however you need. Financial backing, legal protection, connections to investors, whatever it takes to get your new company off the ground. But Stephanie, he waited until I looked back at him. You need to understand that once you start this, there's no going back. Derek will fight dirty. Your family will feel betrayed. Things will get worse before they get better. I know, I said, and I did. I knew it would hurt. I knew it would cost me. But for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't making my decision based on fear of what I might lose. I was making it based on what I refused to lose anymore. My integrity, my father's legacy, my own sense of self. Then let's get to work, Richard said, extending his hand. I shook it, his grip firm and sure, and felt something shift inside me, something that had been broken for so long. I'd forgotten it was supposed to be whole. I didn't know where this battle would lead, but for the first time in 5 years, I felt alive. And the first thing I needed was to face myself. The first thing I needed was to face myself. And to do that, I had to go back to the place I'd been avoiding for 5 years, the storage unit in South Boston, where I'd locked away everything from my old life. I flew back to Oregon the morning after the gala, but I didn't stay long. Just long enough to give my notice at the house I was renting, to pack my meagre belongings to tell Betty I was leaving for something important. She'd hugged me at the door and told me she'd known from the moment I arrived that I wasn't meant to stay in Wilson Creek forever. You got that look about you, she'd said, like you were just catching your breath before the real race started. 3 days later, I was standing in front of a rusted orange storage unit door in a facility that smelled like motor oil and damp cardboard. My hands shook as I worked the combination lock. I'd had to call the company to retrieve the code because I couldn't remember it had actively tried to forget it. The lock clicked open, and I lifted the metal door with a screech that echoed through the empty corridor. Inside was the archaeology of my former life, stacked in labelled boxes and covered in a fine layer of dust. I'd packed it all in a frenzy 5 years ago, throwing things into boxes without looking too closely, because looking hurt too much. Now I forced myself to go through it piece by piece, pulling out folders and notebooks and external hard drives, setting them on the concrete floor in some semblance of organisation. The first prototype was near the bottom of a box labelled Office Supplies. It was a clunky thing built on an old tablet I'd bought used the interface, rough and unpolished but functional. I pressed the power button without much hope, and miraculously it flickered to life, the battery somehow still holding a trace discharge after all these years. The Silver Connect logo I'd designed appeared on the screen, simple, clean, a silver line connecting 2 hearts, and I felt something crack open in my chest. In another box, I found my design notebooks. Pages and pages of sketches, user flow diagrams, feature lists written in my father's handwriting where he'd helped me brainstorm. Emergency button, big red, 1 touch, he'd written in the margin of 1 page. No menus, no confirmation screens, just help. I ran my fingers over the words and could almost hear his voice. And then I found the video. It was on a thumb drive tucked inside an old eyeglass case labelled in permanent marker, Dad Demo Day. I'd forgotten I'd even made it. I plugged it into my laptop with trembling hands and pressed to play. The video was grainy shot on my phone camera, the lighting terrible. But there was my father sitting propped up in his hospital bed 2 weeks before he died, watching me demonstrate the prototype. I watched my younger self move through the app features, explaining how the medication reminders worked, how the fall detection system would alert family members automatically, how everything was designed to be intuitive for someone who'd never used a smartphone before. And there was my father's face lit up with pride and wonder. "My daughter is brilliant," he said on the video, his voice weak but certain. "You're going to help so many people, sweetheart. You're going to change lives." I had to pause the video because I couldn't see through my tears. I sat on the cold concrete floor of that storage unit and sobbed until my ribs ached, mourning everything I'd lost and everything I was about to try to reclaim. It took me 3 days to go through everything, to scan documents, to back up files, to rebuild my digital archives. And as I worked, the vision started coming back to me, not the old vision, but a new one. 5 years had passed. Technology had advanced. I'd learned things working with seniors at Sunset Gardens that I hadn't understood when I was 29, and building Silver Connect in the abstract. I knew now what confused them, what scared them, what they actually needed versus what I'd thought they needed. I started coding again. Not in a fancy office, but in a cheap, extended-stay motel room, near the storage facility surrounded by boxes and powered by gas station coffee, and a determination that felt almost religious in its intensity. I rebuilt the app from the ground up, incorporating everything I'd learned, adding AI features that could detect patterns in behaviour that might indicate health problems, creating a community platform where seniors could connect with each other and share experiences. I made it better, cleaner, more powerful. I registered the new company under a different name to avoid immediate legal complications. Silverline Foundation, a nonprofit focused on senior wellness technology. The name felt right, like a silver lining in the darkness, a lifeline thrown to people who needed it most. Richard had connected me with a small tech incubator, willing to host the company, and within 6 weeks I had a working beta and a handful of senior volunteers testing it. One of them was a former journalist who'd written for tech blogs in her younger years. She loved the app so much she wrote a piece about it for a small online publication I'd never heard of. The article was titled, "The App Your Grandmother Actually Wants to Use," and it described Silverline as elegantly, simple, powerfully effective, and built with genuine empathy for its users. It mentioned almost as an aside that the founder had previously worked on senior tech, before stepping away from the industry for personal reasons. I didn't think much of it until the article got picked up by a larger blog, then another, then another. Within a week, it had gone viral in tech circles. My inbox filled with messages from investors, from journalists, from seniors and their families wanting to try the app. And somewhere in Boston, I knew Derek was reading those articles and starting to worry. But it was while I was organising my legal documents to send to Richard's attorneys that I found something that made all of that momentum suddenly feel meaningless. Tucked into a folder marked Final Paperwork was the cooperation agreement I'd signed 5 years ago, along with supporting documentation I'd been too devastated to read carefully at the time. There were 2 sets of share transfer documents. The first was for the 2% stake that had been in my mother's name, the $5,000 my father had invested under her name for tax reasons. My mother had signed that transfer to Derek. That much I'd known. But there was a second document. A transfer of the 5% Guardian Angel, LLC's stake, the $10,000 investment, my father had structured specifically so it couldn't be transferred without my signature. And the bottom of that document in handwriting I'd recognise anywhere was my mother's signature. She'd signed away my father's protected investment, the one thing he'd set up specifically to keep me safe. She'd signed it over to Derek as if she had the right to do so, as if my father's wishes meant nothing, as if I meant nothing. I stared at that signature until the letters blurred together, feeling my world collapse again in a way that was somehow worse than the first time. The first betrayal had been Derek's, a man I'd barely known who'd exploited my trust for his own gain. But this was my mother, the woman who'd raised me, who'd held me when I cried, who'd been there the day my father died and heard him make me promise to finish what we'd started. Why? Why would my mother help Derek steal my father's company? I needed answers. Now. I was in my car before I'd fully processed the decision. The drive from South Boston to my mother's house in Newton took 23 minutes at 2 a.m, and I spent every one of them gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. The streets were empty streetlights casting yellow pools on wet pavement, and my mind kept circling back to that signature, that unmistakable loop of the E in Ellen, the careful precision of the Cooper surname. My mother's house, the house I'd grown up in, looked smaller than I remembered its white, clapboard siding ghostly in the darkness. A single light glowed in the upstairs window of what used to be my parents' bedroom. She was awake. Or maybe she never slept anymore. I wouldn't know. I'd stopped asking 5 years ago. I didn't knock. I still had my old key buried somewhere in my wallet, but I didn't need it. The front door was unlocked the way it had always been. My mother's stubborn belief that Newton was safe enough not to warrant paranoia. I pushed it open and stepped into the familiar entryway, with its faded floral wallpaper and the smell of lavender sachets my mother tucked into every closet. "Mom!" I called up the stairs, my voice louder than I'd intended, sharp with anger and hurt. "We need to talk. Now." I heard movement above the creak of floorboards, and then she appeared at the top of the stairs in a pale blue robe, her white hair loose around her shoulders, her face slack with shock. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller somehow, more fragile the intervening years, having carved new lines around her mouth and eyes. "Stephanie?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "What are you doing here? It's the middle of the—" "Why did you sign the papers?" I demanded, pulling the folded documents from my jacket pocket and shaking them at her. "The Guardian Angel shares. Dad set those up specifically so they couldn't be transferred without my permission. You had no legal right to sign them over to Derek. So why did you do it?" My mother's face crumpled. She grabbed the banister for support, and for a moment I thought she might collapse right there on the stairs. Where did you get those?" "From my storage unit. The same place I've been keeping everything else from my old life that you helped destroy." I climbed the stairs toward her, my anger propelling me forward. "Answer the question, Mum. Why did you help Derek steal from me? Why did you betray Dad's last wish to protect me?" She backed away from me as I reached the landing, pressing herself against the wall, and I saw her hands were shaking. "You don't understand," she said, tears already streaming down her face. "You don't know Then explain it to me," I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay strong. "Make me understand how you could do that to your own daughter." She turned and walked into her bedroom, moving like someone much older than 68, and I followed. The room still smelled like my father's aftershave somehow, even after 5 years, and I saw that his side of the closet still held his clothes. His reading glasses still sat on his nightstand. My mother sank onto the edge of the bed and covered her face with her hands. "Derek found out about the retirement fund," she said, her voice muffled. "The money I withdrew early to pay for your father's treatments, the experimental therapies that insurance wouldn't cover, the specialists, the medications. I thought if I could just get him a few more months, maybe a year." She broke off sobbing. "But I withdrew it wrong. I didn't report it correctly on our taxes. I was so overwhelmed, so scared, and I made mistakes. Expensive mistakes." I felt the anger drain out of me, replaced by something colder. "Derek found your tax returns. He has a friend who's an accountant. He was helping me sort through your father's estate paperwork, or at least that's what he said he was doing." "Miles," she looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "He came to me 3 months after your father died. He showed me the forms, showed me the mistakes. He said the IRS could come after me for tens of thousands in penalties. He said I could face criminal charges. That at my age, with my health, her voice cracked, he said I could go to prison. So he blackmailed you. The words came out flat, devoid of emotion. He said he could make it go away. He'd already paid off the money I owed your father's medical debt, all of it. $200,000. He said if I helped him, if I signed the papers and stayed quiet, he'd forget about the tax issues. And Melissa... She wrapped her arms around herself. Melissa was pregnant. She needed stability. She needed Derek, or at least I thought she did. I thought if I could just protect her, keep the family together. You chose her over me. The realization settled over me like ice water. You thought Melissa was more important. I thought she was weaker, my mother said, and there was anguish in her voice now. I thought she needed protection more than you did. You were always so strong, so independent, so much like your father. I thought you'd be okay, that you'd land on your feet somehow. But Melissa was always fragile, always needed someone to lean on. I convinced myself I was making an impossible choice, that I had to save one daughter at the expense of the other. She reached out toward me, her hand trembling. I was wrong. God help me, I was so wrong. I didn't save Melissa. I just enabled Derek to control her. And I lost the daughter I was most proud of. The words hit me like a physical blow. You were proud of me. Of course I was proud of you. She said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like she couldn't comprehend that I didn't know. Your father and I used to lie awake at night talking about you, about how brave you were to chase your dream, how innovative your ideas were. He used to say you had more courage in your little finger than most people had in their whole body. And I agreed with him. I always agreed. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But when Derek came to me with those papers, with that threat hanging over me, I was so scared. I was weak when I needed to be strong, and I've regretted it every single day since. I stood there in my parents' bedroom in the house where I'd grown up, believing family meant loyalty and protection, and felt 5 years of anger begin to crack and shift into something more complicated. My mother wasn't the villain I'd needed her to be. She was just a frightened, elderly woman who'd made a terrible choice under impossible pressure, who'd been manipulated by the same man who'd manipulated me. I moved toward the bed and sat down beside her, and after a moment's hesitation, I put my arm around her thin shoulders. She collapsed against me, sobbing into my shoulder the way I used to sob into hers when I was a child, and I held her while she cried. I'm sorry, she kept saying. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. I know, I said quietly. I know you are. We sat like that for a long time, until her tears subsided and the sky outside began to lighten with the first hint of dawn. Finally, she pulled away and wiped her face with the sleeve of her robe. There's something else, she said. Something your father wanted you to have. I've been keeping it for years, waiting for... I don't know what I was waiting for. The right moment, maybe, or the courage to face you. She stood and went to her dresser, opened the top drawer and pulled out an old manila envelope, its edges worn and soft with age. He made me promise, she said, handing it to me. He said to give it to you when you needed it most. I think maybe this is that time. I took the envelope with shaking hands, seeing my name written across the front in my father's unmistakable handwriting. The seal had never been broken. Whatever was inside, my mother had honoured his wishes and kept it sealed all these years. I hugged my mother for the first time in 5 years and felt forgiveness creeping into my heart like dawn light through curtains. But I couldn't open the envelope yet, not in front of her, not in this moment. I was afraid of what it might contain, afraid of what my father's words from beyond the grave might do to the fragile equilibrium we'd just found. I left my mother's house as the sun was rising, the sealed envelope pressed against my chest like a talisman. I'd promised her we'd talk more later, that we'd figure out together how to move forward, But right then, I needed to be alone. I needed to read my father's words without anyone watching me fall apart. I drove to the place I always went when I needed to think, the parking lot overlooking the Charles River, where my father used to take me on Saturday mornings when I was a child. We'd sit on the hood of his car with thermoses of hot chocolate and watch the rowing teams glide across the water, their oars cutting perfect synchronized arcs through the surface. He'd tell me stories about the war, about his dreams, about the kind of person he hoped I'd become. Be brave, he'd always said. Not fearless, that's different. Brave means you're scared, but you do it anyway. I parked in the same spot we'd always used and climbed onto the hood of my rental car, the metal cold through my jeans. The river was quiet this early, just a few dedicated runners on the path below and the distant honk of geese. I turned the envelope over in my hand, studying my name in my father's handwriting, that distinctive capital S with its extra flourish at the top. He'd always sign my birthday cards that way too. My hand shook as I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds, and a smaller envelope labelled "Legal Documents Do Not Lose." I set the smaller envelope aside and unfolded the letter, and my father's voice came through so clearly in the words that I could almost hear him speaking them. "My dearest Stephanie," it began, and I had to pause because my vision blurred immediately. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry I can't be there to see what I know you're going to accomplish. I'm writing this at 2 a.m, 3 months after the diagnosis, and your mother is sleeping in the chair beside my hospital bed. She doesn't know I'm doing this. She'd worry, and she has enough to worry about. I need you to know something about the investment I made in your company. I didn't just hand you $15,000 and hope for the best. I set it up carefully, strategically, because I knew even then that the world doesn't always treat dreamers kindly, and I wanted to protect you. 10,000 of that money went through a limited liability company I created called Guardian Angel, LLC. I own 100% of that company, and that company owns 5% of Silver Connect. The operating agreement for Guardian Angel contains a very specific clause. Those shares cannot be transferred, sold, or assigned without the written consent of both the LLC owner and the founder of Silver Connect. That's you, sweetheart. I had a lawyer draft it that way specifically. Your signature is required. Always. The other 5,000 is different. I put it in your mother's name for tax reasons, and yes, technically, she could sign that over if she chose to. But the Guardian Angel shares, those are locked, protected. No one can take them from you without your permission. I'm telling you this because I'm not naive about the world, about business, about the way people can surprise you sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. If something happens, if someone tries to steal what you've built, you need to know you have leverage. You need to know your father built you a safety net. All the documents are with Harrison & Associates, a law firm on State Street in Boston. I've already paid them a retainer to hold the paperwork in perpetuity. The contact information is in the sealed envelope. If you ever need help, if anyone ever tries to claim what's yours, go to them. They'll know what to do. But here's what I really want you to hear, the reason I'm writing this at 2 a.m. when my hands barely work anymore. You were always the brave one. From the time you were 5 years old and you climbed that tree everyone said was too high, to the day you told me you were quitting your teaching job to chase this crazy, beautiful dream, you've always had more courage than anyone I've ever known. The world is going to try to tell you you're not enough, that you're too young, too female, too inexperienced, too naive, too whatever excuse they can think of to diminish you. Don't you dare believe them. You are enough. You have always been enough. And any success you achieve, any life you save with your technology, any difference you make, you'll have earned every bit of it. I'm so proud to be your father. I'm so grateful I got to see you become the woman you are. And even though I won't be there to watch you succeed, and you will succeed, sweetheart, I have absolutely no doubt about that. I'll be with you in every line of code you write, Every user you help, every moment you choose to be brave instead of safe. Do what's right no matter what anyone says, even if it costs you. Especially if it costs you. Because at the end of your life, the only thing that matters is whether you can look yourself in the mirror and like the person looking back. I love you forever, my brilliant girl. Make me proud. Or rather, make yourself proud. I already am. Love, Dad. I read it 3 times, through tears streaming down my face, my chest so tight I could barely breathe. He'd known. Somehow, even while dying, he'd known I might need protection. He'd built me a foundation that couldn't be stolen, a legal structure that gave me power even when I felt powerless. And, more than that, he'd given me permission to fight, to be angry, to demand what was rightfully mine. I opened the smaller envelope with shaking hands and found a business card for Harrison and Associates, along with a case number and a handwritten note from my father. They're expecting you, don't wait too long. I looked at my phone. It was barely 6:30 in the morning, too early to call a law office, but I couldn't wait. I couldn't sit with this knowledge for hours, letting it burn inside me. I needed to act, needed to move, needed to start reclaiming what had been taken. I dialed the number on the card expecting to get a voicemail, a recorded message telling me to call back during business hours. Instead, after 2 rings, someone picked up. Harrison and Associates, how may I direct your call? It was a young man's voice, professional but warm. I'm sorry, I didn't expect anyone to answer so early. My name is Stephanie Cooper. I'm calling about some documents my father left with your firm. The case number is Ms. Cooper. The voice changed, becoming more alert, more personal. This is Marcus Chen. I've been waiting for your call. I froze my breath, catching in my throat. Marcus Chen. The name echoed in my head, dragging me back 5 years to a hospital room in Oregon, to an elderly woman who told me I was the kindest person she'd ever met, to her son who'd pressed his business card into my palm and told me to call if I ever needed anything. Marcus Chen, Agnes's son, the woman I'd saved. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. I sat there in my parked car with my father's letter still clutched in my other hand, trying to make sense of the impossible connection between Agnes Chen's son and the law firm my father had entrusted with his final protection of me. Miss Cooper, Marcus's voice came through the phone, concerned now. Are you still there? Yes. I'm sorry, I took a shaky breath. Your mother, Agnes, how is she? There was a pause, and when Marcus spoke again, his voice was softer, heavy with old grief. She passed away 2 years ago, peacefully in her sleep. She was 84. Another pause. But she talked about you almost every day until the end. She called you her angel, said you saved her life when no one else was there, that you held her hand through the worst night of her life and didn't leave even when your shift ended. Tears spilled down my cheeks again. I'd thought about Agnes often over the years, wondered how she was doing, but I'd lost track of her after I left Sunset Gardens. I'm so sorry. She was a wonderful woman. She was, Marcus agreed, and she made sure I understood exactly how much your kindness meant to her. She revised her will 3 weeks after she got out of the hospital, added a specific provision instructing me that if I ever encountered you, if you ever needed help with anything at all, I was to provide it. No questions asked. She said it was a debt she could never repay, but she wanted to try. I pressed my hand against my mouth, overwhelmed. I didn't do it expecting anything in return. She needed someone. I know, Marcus said gently. That's why she wanted to help you. Because you're the kind of person who helps without expecting anything. He cleared his throat, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. When your father's case was transferred to me 2.5 years ago, after the senior partner who'd been handling it retired, I saw your name on the file, Stephanie Cooper. I almost called you then, but the terms of your father's arrangement were very specific. You had to initiate contact. He didn't want anyone pressuring you or making you feel obligated to use the documents he'd left. So I waited. and I kept the file on my active desk instead of in storage, just in case. You've been waiting for me to call for 2.5 years. I figured if you needed us, you'd reach out eventually. And if you didn't, well, maybe that meant everything had worked out fine and you didn't need the legal protection your father set up. He paused. But I had a feeling that wasn't the case. I've been following Silver Connect Solutions in the news. I noticed your name never appeared in their founder story, which struck me as odd given the early documentation in your father's file. And then, recently articles about Silverline Foundation started appearing, and I recognised your approach, your vision. I wondered if maybe things were finally coming to a head. They are, I said, or they're about to. I found documents showing that someone transferred my father's guardian angel, LLC shares without my permission. My mother signed the paperwork, but she didn't have the legal authority to do so. The operating agreement my father set up required my signature for any transfer. I have that operating agreement right here, Marcus said, and I heard the satisfaction in his voice. Along with the original articles of incorporation for Guardian Angel LLC, the stock certificates, and your father's very detailed memo explaining why he structured the investment this way. Ms. Cooper, those shares cannot legally be transferred without your written consent. If someone is claiming ownership based on documents that don't bear your signature, those documents are fraudulent. The word hung in the air between us. Fraudulent. Not just ethically wrong or morally bankrupt, but legally actionable. Criminal, even. Derek Walsh, I said. My sister's husband. He's the one who took the company. He manipulated my mother into signing paperwork she didn't have the authority to sign, and he used it to claim legitimacy. Then he's committed fraud, Marcus said simply. And we can prove it. Your father made sure of that. I heard him typing. I'm looking at your case file now. Your father paid a substantial retainer to keep this in inactive status indefinitely. He wanted to make sure that no matter how much time passed, you'd have the legal support you needed. There's enough money here to fund a full litigation team for at least 2 years, and if we need more, I suspect your friend Mr. Morrison would be happy to contribute. You know about Richard? He called me 3 days ago, Marcus said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Told me he'd reconnected with David Cooper's daughter at a corporate event and that you might be reaching out soon. He wanted to make sure we were prepared to move quickly when you were ready. He spoke very highly of you and of your father. I leaned back against the car headrest, feeling something that might have been hope unfurling in my chest. What happens now? Now we build your case, Marcus said. We'll need to gather evidence, all your early documentation, prototypes, communications, anything that proves you were the founder and creator of the technology. We'll need witness statements from people who worked with you during the development phase. We'll need to establish a timeline that shows Derek's involvement came after the technology was already created. And we'll use the Guardian Angel LLC documents to prove that even if everything else were murky, Derek never had legal claim to those shares, which means his ownership of the company is fundamentally compromised. How long will it take? To build the case, a few months if we're thorough. To get to trial could be a year, maybe more. These things move slowly. He paused. But, Ms. Cooper, Stephanie, I need you to understand something. This is going to get ugly. Derek will fight back. He'll try to discredit you to make you look incompetent or vindictive. He'll drag your family through the mud. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my father's letter about his words. Do what's right, even if it costs you. I thought about 5 years of silence, of watching Derek and Melissa build an empire on my foundation while I worked for $12 an hour. I thought about all the seniors who could have been helped by Silver Connect if it had stayed true to its original mission, instead of becoming just another profit-driven tech company. I'm prepared, I said, but Marcus, I need to do something first. Before we file anything, before we go public with this, I need to prove that I'm still capable of innovation, that I'm not just trying to reclaim something old. I need to build something new, something better, something that shows the court and the world that the real vision, the real genius behind this technology was always mine. There was a moment of silence, and then Marcus said, "You're talking about Silverline." "Yes, I'm going to make it extraordinary. I'm going to make it so good that when people see it side by side with Silver Connect, there will be no question about which one has the soul of the founder and which one is just a hollow imitation." I gripped my father's letter tighter. "And then, when we walk into that courtroom, the evidence won't just be in documents and testimony, it'll be in the work itself." "That's going to take time," Marcus warned. "Months of development, beta testing, refinement." "I have time," I said. "And I have something Derek and Melissa never had. I actually care about the people I'm trying to help. That has to count for something." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, there was warmth in his voice that reminded me achingly of his mother. "My mum would have loved this. She always said you had a good heart. She would have been proud to see you fighting back." He cleared his throat. "Keep developing Silverline. Make it everything you dreamed Silver Connect could be. Create something so undeniably superior that when the court sees it, when the world sees it, they'll understand immediately who the real genius is. And when you're ready, when your work speaks for itself, we'll file the lawsuit. Derek won't have any defense against the truth." I smiled through my tears, feeling something I hadn't felt in 5 years, not just hope, but certainty. Time for the world to remember my name. The success of Silverline felt surreal in a way I hadn't anticipated. Every morning, I'd wake up to new user testimonials, new download numbers that seemed impossible, new stories of lives saved by technology I'd created. By October, we'd crossed 50,000 active users, and our AI fall detection system had successfully identified and responded to 37 serious falls, getting help to people who might otherwise have died alone in their homes. 37 lives. I kept that number written on a sticky note on my monitor, a reminder of why this mattered more than the money, or the recognition, or the vindication. But with Silverline's rise came Silver Connect's fall, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a grim satisfaction watching Derek's empire crumble. Their quarterly earnings report in September was devastating. 40% of their user base had abandoned the platform in favour of Silverline, or simply given up on senior tech altogether after feeling betrayed by Silver Connect's pivot toward monetization over usability. The stock price collapsed from $42 to barely $15, and 3 major investors pulled out of their Series C funding round, citing lack of confidence in leadership and direction. Derek's response was to go on the attack. He started with social media posting increasingly unhinged threads about corporate espionage and sabotage, about bitter people who couldn't handle seeing others succeed. He never named me directly in those early posts, but the tech community wasn't stupid. Everyone knew who he meant. Someone dug up the old Tech Innovators article about me from 7 years ago, and suddenly people were asking questions Derek couldn't answer convincingly. Why wasn't the original founder involved in the company anymore? What had happened to Stephanie Cooper? Where did Derek and Melissa actually come from in this story? A journalist from Wired reached out to me for an interview. I almost said no. I'd spent so many years being invisible that being seen again felt dangerous. But Marcus encouraged me to tell my story, to get ahead of whatever narrative Derek was building. So, I invited her to my office and showed her everything, the original prototypes, my design notebooks filled with my father's handwriting. The video of him calling me brilliant 2 weeks before he died, the timeline proving I'd been working on this technology years before Derek entered my life. The article she published was devastating to Silver Connect. The founder they forgot went viral within hours, shared tens of thousands of times, picked up by morning shows and tech podcasts. People were outraged. Former Silver Connect users flooded the company's social media, with angry comments demanding explanations. Several engineers who'd worked there and been fired in Derek's recent purge came forward with stories about his toxic management style, his tendency to take credit for others' work, his complete lack of understanding of the actual technology. Through my mother, who maintained fragile contact with Melissa, I started hearing fragments of what was happening inside their house. Derek was unraveling. He'd fired half his team in a rage, accusing them of incompetence, then spent weeks trying desperately to copy Silverline's features without understanding why they worked. He was drinking heavily, staying up until 3 or 4 in the morning, obsessing over Silverline's user reviews, comparing them to Silver Connect's plummeting ratings. He'd put a hole in the wall of his home office. He'd thrown his laptop across the room and destroyed it. And Melissa, my sister, who I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, was starting to crack under the pressure. My mother told me, her voice hushed with worry, that Melissa had called her crying one night. Derek had screamed at her for hours, blaming her for not being smart enough, not being the asset he'd thought she was, not earning her position as co-founder. He told her she was worthless, that she'd contributed nothing, that he should have gone into business with someone competent instead of saddling himself with dead weight. Their 4-year-old daughter, Sophie, had heard everything and had started having nightmares, waking up crying for her mother. "She wants to leave him," my mother whispered during one of our phone calls. "But she's terrified. Everything is in his name. The house, the accounts, everything. She has no money, no job, nowhere to go. And she's afraid if she tries to leave, he'll find a way to take Sophie from her." I wanted to feel sympathy. I wanted to feel sisterly compassion. But every time I tried to soften toward Melissa, I remembered her standing beside Derek 5 years ago, silent and complicit, while he stole my father's investment, my work, my entire future. She'd had choices then too. She'd made them. What I didn't know, what no one knew except Melissa, was that she was making choices now too. Small, careful, terrified choices. She'd started documenting everything. When Derek went on his rages, she'd hide in the bathroom with her phone and record audio. When he sent threatening emails to former employees or fired off abuse at investors in late-night messages, she'd screenshot them before he could delete them. And she'd begun searching through his files, finding the emails from 7 years ago, where he had coldly plotted how to acquire Cooper's intellectual property through the sister relationship, where he had coached Melissa on exactly what to say to gain my trust, how to position their involvement as family support rather than corporate espionage. She'd saved everything to a small USB drive and hidden it in the hollow compartment of a silver bracelet our father had given us when we were teenagers, matching bracelets we'd both treasured. She wore it every day, and Derek never thought to question it. It was just jewelry. He had no idea she was walking around with evidence that could destroy him locked against her wrist. But she was still too afraid to use it, too afraid of losing her daughter, of being left with nothing, of Derek's retaliation, so she stayed quiet, trapped, waiting for something to give her the courage she couldn't find on her own. Then, Derek did something unforgivable. His PR team, desperate to salvage what was left of Silver Connect's reputation, booked him on a local morning show to tell his side of the story. And he insisted Melissa come with him. Not asked, insisted. Told her that if she didn't sit beside him and back him up, if she didn't play the role of supportive wife and co-founder, he'd make sure she regretted it. So she went. I watched the interview from my office, my team gathered around the laptop, all of us holding our breath as Derek sat in the studio with his arm around Melissa's shoulders, his smile practiced and confident despite the desperation I could see lurking beneath it. "The truth is," Derek said, leaning forward earnestly, "Stephanie Cooper is a deeply troubled person who can't accept that some people are simply more capable of execution than ideation. She had a nice idea 7 years ago, but she lacked the business acumen, the technical sophistication, the leadership skills to turn it into reality. My wife and I built Silver Connect from the ground up, and now that we're successful, Stephanie is trying to rewrite history out of bitterness and jealousy." The host turned to Melissa. "Mrs. Walsh, what do you say to people who claim your sister was the true founder?" Melissa's face was pale. Her hands were folded so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. I saw her jaw tighten, saw something flicker in her eyes that might have been anguish, or might have been rage. And then she nodded. Stephanie Cooper is a liar, Derek said, his voice hardening. And she's trying to destroy my family. My sister nodded again. I watched my sister nod along with Derek's lies, and something inside me finally broke free. Not broke apart, broke free, like a bird that had been caged so long it forgot it had wings suddenly remembering. Within an hour of that interview, airing, my phone started ringing. Journalists from CNN, MSNBC, NPR, all wanting my response to Derek's accusations. My team was fielding calls faster than they could answer them, and Richard called to say Good Morning America wanted me on the show the next day. Marcus texted me, "Don't respond yet, let them come to you. When you speak, make it count." So I waited. I spent the evening in my office going through boxes of documentation with Marcus, on video call organising everything into a narrative that was clear and irrefutable. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk rehearsing what I wanted to say, reminding myself that anger would only make me look exactly how Derek had painted me, bitter and vindictive. I needed to be calm. I needed to be truthful. I needed to let the evidence speak louder than my emotions. Good Morning America sent a car for me at 5 a.m. I wore a simple blue blouse and black pants, professional, unremarkable, the opposite of someone trying to grab attention. I brought a tablet loaded with documents and videos, and I brought my father's broken watch in my pocket like a talisman. The host, Maria Alvarez, greeted me in the green room with surprising warmth. "I saw your sister's interview yesterday," she said quietly, "and I did my research last night. I think people need to hear what you have to say." When I walked onto the set, the studio audience was already seated, mostly women in their 50s and 60s, some older. I sat across from Maria, my hands folded calmly in my lap, and waited for her to begin. "Stephanie Cooper, thank you for joining us. I want to start by addressing what Derek Walsh said about you yesterday. He claimed you're lying about being the founder of Silver Connect, that you're trying to destroy his family out of bitterness. What's your response?" I took a breath. I'm not here to respond to Derek Walsh. I'm here to share the truth, and then people can decide for themselves what to believe. I pulled out my tablet. This is a video I made 7 years ago. I'd like you to watch it. The monitors around the studio flickered to life. There was my father in his hospital bed, thin and pale, but smiling as 29-year-old me demonstrated the prototype. His voice came through the speakers, weak but clear. "My daughter is brilliant. You're going to help so many people, sweetheart. You're going to change lives." The studio was silent. I saw several people in the audience wipe their eyes. That's my father, David Cooper, 2 weeks before he died of cancer. He was my first investor, $15,000, everything he had left. He believed in this dream when no one else did. I swiped to the next document. These are emails from 7 years ago, time-stamped, showing me sending prototype code and design documents to Derek Walsh, with notes saying, "Could you review this for me?" And "Thanks for offering to help find investors." Another swipe. These are my design notebooks filled with my handwriting and my father's notes. These are testimonials from the beta testers I recruited. And this, I pulled up the legal documents. This is the Guardian Angel LLC registration my father filed, giving him 5% equity in Silver Connect with the explicit provision that those shares cannot be transferred without my written consent. Derek doesn't have my signature. He never did. Maria leaned forward. "So you're saying your father's investment is still legally yours?" "I'm saying my father protected me in ways I didn't understand until recently. And I'm saying that everything I'm showing you is verifiable, documentable truth. I'm not asking anyone to take my word for it. I'm providing evidence. What do you want people to know about what happened?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. I want people to know that I didn't come back after 5 years because I'm bitter. I came back because I remembered who I was before fear made me small. I spent half a decade letting other people tell my story, define my worth, erase my existence, and I'm not doing that anymore. I pressed my hand against my heart. I'm not here to defeat Derek and Melissa. I'm here to find myself again. And I found her. She was there the whole time waiting for me to be brave enough to stand up. The audience started applauding. It began with one person, then spread like a wave until everyone was standing, clapping some with tears streaming down their faces. Maria waited for them to settle, then said, "We have time for a few questions from the audience." An elderly woman in the third row stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the microphone. "Miss Cooper, I just want to say your app, Silverline, it saved my mother's life 3 weeks ago. She fell in her apartment and your system called the ambulance automatically. The doctors said if help had arrived even 10 minutes later, she wouldn't have survived." Her voice broke. "You didn't just create technology. You gave me more time with my mother. Thank you." I couldn't speak for a moment. I just nodded, blinking back tears. Another woman stood. "What would you say to other women who've been silenced or pushed aside? How did you find the courage to fight back?" I thought about the question seriously. I'd say don't wait for someone to save you. Don't wait for permission or validation or the perfect moment. Just ask yourself one question. Do I believe in myself? And if the answer is yes, even if it's a quiet, uncertain yes, then you already have everything you need. The courage comes later. You just have to start. "But what about family?" Another voice called. "What if fighting back means losing people you love?" "Then you have to decide what kind of love you're willing to accept," I said quietly. "Real love doesn't require you to erase yourself. Real love doesn't demand your silence in exchange for belonging. And sometimes the people who claim to love you are really just asking you to stay small so they can feel big. That's not love. That's control." The interview lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, Maria hugged me off camera and whispered, "You did good." I flew back to Boston in a daze, watching my phone explode with notifications. The interview was being shared everywhere: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. People were posting clips with their own stories of being overlooked, erased, silenced. A hashtag started trending, "Justice for Stephanie." By the next morning, it had 12 million mentions. Derek's office was reportedly surrounded by reporters shouting questions he wouldn't answer. Silver Connect's board called an emergency meeting. 2 more investors pulled out entirely. And then my phone rang with Marcus's number. "It's time," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "We're filing the lawsuit today. I've got reporters ready to cover it, and the evidence is airtight. Are you ready for this?" I looked around my office at my team working on code that would help people, at the testimonials pinned to my wall, at the photo of my father I kept on my desk, and I smiled. I've been ready for 5 years. The lawsuit moved forward with the inexorable momentum of something that had been waiting too long to happen. Marcus filed the papers on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, it was the lead story on every major tech news site. Original Silver Connect founder sues for fraud and intellectual property theft. The case number was assigned Cooper Vet. Walsh and Silver Connect Solutions Incur discovery began immediately, both sides exchanging thousands of pages of documents, deposing witnesses, building their arguments for a confrontation that would determine not just who owned what, but whose truth would be believed. The trial began on a cold morning in February, exactly 7 months after I'd watched my sister call me a liar on television. The courtroom in Boston's Federal Building was packed. Journalists in the back rows, my supporters on one side, Derek's remaining allies on the other. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Marcus beside me, his calm confidence steadying my shaking hands. Across the aisle, Derek wore an expensive suit and an expression of injured dignity playing the role of wronged businessman. Melissa sat behind him in the gallery, her face pale, her 4-year-old daughter Sophie clutching a stuffed rabbit in her lap. Marcus's opening statement was surgical. He didn't rely on emotion or dramatics. He simply laid out a timeline backed by irrefutable evidence, showing that I had been working on senior care technology years before Derek entered my life, that every major innovation in Silver Connect had originated from my prototypes and design documents, that Derek had systematically appropriated my work while erasing my involvement. He presented the Guardian Angel LLC documents, proving my father's investment included specific protections that Derek had violated by claiming ownership of those shares. Derek's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Vance, countered with the argument I'd expected. "Ideas aren't protectable," she said smoothly. "Ms. Cooper may have had a concept, but concepts don't build companies. My client and his wife took a rough notion and transformed it into a viable, successful business through their own expertise, investment, and hard work. This case is about a disgruntled former associate trying to claim credit for others' achievements. The first week of trial was a parade of technical witnesses. Marcus brought in my original beta testers, elderly volunteers who testified that I had personally recruited them, designed the interface based on their feedback, and spent countless hours refining features to meet their needs. He presented metadata analysis, showing that the core codebase of Silver Connect matched exactly the architectural patterns of my early prototypes down to the variable naming conventions and commenting style. He brought in the journalist who'd written the Tech Innovators article, who testified that Derek had never been mentioned in her research or interviews 7 years ago. Derek's team tried to punch holes in the timeline, suggesting I'd backdated documents or fabricated evidence. But Marcus was ready for every challenge. For every document they questioned, he had corroborating evidence emails from third parties, dated photographs, testimony from people with no stake in the outcome. Then came my mother. I hadn't known Marcus was calling her until I saw her name on the witness list. She walked to the stand slowly, looking every one of her 68 years, and placed her hand on the Bible with fingers that trembled. Under Marcus's gentle questioning, she told the court about Derek's blackmail, about the tax issues he'd discovered, and weaponized about the impossible choice he'd forced her to make between protecting one daughter and betraying another. He told me that if I didn't sign the papers transferring the Guardian Angel shares, he would report me to the IRS, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He said I could go to prison. He said Melissa's baby would be born while I was incarcerated. I was terrified. I was wrong, but I was terrified. Derek's lawyer attacked her on cross-examination, suggesting she was lying to protect me, that her testimony was convenient fiction designed to excuse her own complicity. My mother absorbed every accusation with bent shoulders and streaming tears, and I wanted to stand up and demand they stop, but Marcus squeezed my hand under the table, reminding me to stay silent, to trust the process. Derek took the stand in his own defense, polished and confident, spinning a narrative in which he was the visionary entrepreneur who'd salvaged a failing project from an incompetent founder. He claimed I'd been grateful for his involvement, that I'd begged him to take over because I was overwhelmed and out of my depth. He painted himself as a generous benefactor who'd tried to help family and been repaid with false accusations. Marcus's cross-examination was devastating. He produced email after email in which Derek had privately acknowledged my role as founder, had discussed strategies for managing the Cooper sister situation, had explicitly stated that the technology was mine, but the business opportunity was his. But Derek deflected every question, claiming the emails were taken out of context, that private communications didn't reflect the full complexity of the business relationship. The trial was entering its 3rd week, and I was starting to worry that despite all our evidence, Derek's confidence and his expensive lawyers might create enough doubt to save him. The judge seemed skeptical of both sides, asking pointed questions that suggested she wasn't sure who to believe. Then Melissa stood up. It happened during Derek's testimony while he was explaining how he and Melissa had jointly developed Silver Connect's core features. There was a sound from the gallery, a chair scraping, and every head in the courtroom turned to see my sister rising to her feet, her hand gripping the silver bracelet on her wrist, her face white but determined. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking but audible. "I have evidence." The courtroom erupted. Derek's face went from confident to panicked in an instant. His lawyer shouted objections. The judge gavelled for order, her expression startled but intrigued. "Approach the bench," Judge Martinez said, and Marcus was on his feet, immediately gesturing for Melissa to come forward. I watched my sister walk down the aisle toward the witness stand, saw Derek leaning over to his lawyer and hissing something urgent, saw Sophie in the gallery starting to cry because her mother had left her. Melissa's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the USB drive she pulled from the hollow compartment of her bracelet, but Marcus was there to steady her, to guide her to the witness stand to ask the judge if she could testify as a surprise witness. Derek's lawyer objected strenuously, claiming this was theatrical ambush, but Judge Martinez overruled her. "If there's relevant evidence, I want to hear it. Ms. Walsh, you understand? You're under oath." "Yes, Your Honor." Melissa's voice was barely audible. Marcus inserted the USB drive into the courtroom's display system, and Melissa began to speak. She told the court about the emails she'd found on Derek's computer, the ones where he had mapped out his plan to acquire Cooper's IP through the sister relationship. She played audio recordings of Derek raging about me in their home, admitting in fury what he'd never admit under oath, that he'd stolen my work, that he'd manipulated my mother, that the entire founding story of Silver Connect was a lie he'd constructed and forced Melissa to maintain. "I knew," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I knew from the beginning what we were doing to her, and I let it happen because I was weak and selfish and I wanted the life Derek was offering me. But I can't do it anymore. My sister deserves this. She deserves everything. I'm sorry I was a coward for so long." Derek was on his feet, shouting that Melissa had stolen his private files, that the evidence was inadmissible, that she'd been coerced. But his panic only made him look guilty, and Judge Martinez ordered him to sit down and be quiet. The trial ended 3 days later. Judge Martinez took only 2 hours to deliberate before returning with her ruling. Having reviewed the evidence presented, including the recently submitted materials, I find that Ms. Stephanie Cooper is the rightful founder and creator of the technology underlying Silver Connect. The Guardian Angel LLC shares were fraudulently transferred, the intellectual property was misappropriated, and Mr. Derek Walsh engaged in deliberate deception to claim ownership of work that was not his own. I hereby order that all intellectual property rights revert to Ms. Cooper, that Mr. Walsh and Silver Connect Solutions pay damages in the amount of $3.2 million, and that Mr. Richard Walsh is barred from claiming any founder title or equity in the company going forward. The courtroom exploded with noise, cheers from my supporters, shouted objections from Derek's team, reporters scrambling for the exits to file their stories. Marcus was shaking my hand. Richard was hugging me, strangers were congratulating me. But I wasn't looking at any of them. I was looking at Melissa sitting in the gallery with her daughter in her arms, her face buried in Sophie's hair, her shoulders shaking with sobs. And I felt nothing. Not triumph, not vindication, not satisfaction. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where I'd expected relief to be. The emptiness didn't go away. Not when Marcus walked me through the formal judgment paperwork. Not when journalists surrounded me on the courthouse steps asking how it felt to finally be vindicated. Not even when I returned to my office that evening, and my entire team had hung a banner reading "Justice for Stephanie," and open champagne they couldn't really afford. I went through the motions. I smiled for the photos. I thanked everyone for their support. I gave a brief statement to the press about truth and perseverance and the importance of standing up for yourself. And then I went back to my apartment, sat on the floor with my back against the couch, and stared at the wall until midnight, wondering why I felt like I'd lost something instead of won. The settlement money would take weeks to process, but Marcus had already confirmed the amount $3.2 million. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having. It was compensation for 5 years of lost income for emotional damages, for the theft of my father's investment. It was supposed to feel like justice. Instead, it felt like a number on a page that couldn't buy back the years I'd spent working. For $12 an hour, couldn't resurrect my father to tell him I'd kept my promise. Couldn't undo the fact that my own sister had looked me in the eye and called me a liar on national television. The news coverage over the following days was relentless. Derek was arrested on fraud charges, not just related to me, but to a dozen other financial irregularities the investigation had uncovered, including misuse of investor funds and tax evasion. The images of him being led away in handcuffs made the front page of every major newspaper. Some part of me had wanted to see him face consequences for what he'd done. But watching it actually happen just made me feel sick. Melissa filed for divorce within 48 hours of the verdict. I heard through my mother that she'd taken Sophie and moved back into our childhood home, sleeping in her old bedroom like she was a teenager again, instead of a 32-year-old woman whose life had imploded. She had no job, no income, no prospects. Her name was Mud in Boston social circles, the woman who'd helped her husband steal from her own sister, then betrayed him when it suited her. Nobody trusted her. Nobody wanted to be associated with her. My mother's health deteriorated sharply in the weeks after the trial. The stress of testifying, of having the family's private dysfunction exposed in open court, of watching both her daughters suffer, took its toll in blood pressure spikes and dizzy spells that landed her in the emergency room twice. When I visited her in the hospital, she could barely look at me, shame and exhaustion written in every line of her face. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." "I know, Mum," I'd reply, holding her papery hand and feeling like we were both ghosts haunting the ruins of our family. The extended family that had filled the seats at Melissa's wedding gala 8 months ago wanted nothing to do with any of us now. We were a scandal, a cautionary tale, a source of embarrassment. My Aunt Martha sent a terse email saying she thought it was best if we kept our distance for a while, which I understood to mean forever. So this was victory. Derek in jail, Melissa divorced and unemployed, my mother sick with stress, our family name synonymous with fraud and betrayal. I'd gotten everything I'd fought for, and it had cost everything and everyone I'd once loved. Richard found me in my office on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the verdict, staring at my computer screen without actually seeing it. He knocked on my open door, and I looked up to find him watching me with an expression that was far too knowing. "You don't look like someone who just won $3 million and complete vindication," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I don't feel like it either," I admitted. There didn't seem to be much point in pretending. "Want to talk about why?" I leaned back in my chair, trying to find words for the hollowness. "I spent 5 years believing that if I could just prove I was right, if I could just make them admit what they'd done, I'd feel whole again. But I don't. I feel like I've been fighting for so long that I forgot what I was fighting for. Recognition, justice, revenge." I shook my head. Now I have the recognition, the justice, the money, all of it. And I still feel lost. Richard was quiet for a moment, studying me, with those sharp eyes that had seen through Derek's lies from the beginning. "You fought for recognition," he finally said. "And now you have it. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "That's because recognition was never the real goal," Richard said gently. "It was just what you thought you needed to feel worthy again. But worth doesn't come from courtroom victories, or compensation checks, or people finally believing your story. It comes from believing in yourself, from doing work that matters, from being the person you want to be regardless of who's watching." He leaned forward. You've spent 5 years fighting to reclaim your past. Maybe it's time to start building your future. I wanted to argue with him, but I couldn't. He was right. I'd been so focused on getting back what was taken that I'd forgotten to imagine what came next. I was still thinking about Richard's words that evening when I ran into my mother outside the hospital after one of her cardiac appointments. She looked smaller than ever, bundled in a coat that seemed to swallow her, but her eyes were clearer than they'd been in weeks. "I'm glad I caught you," she said. "I wanted to tell you your father would be so proud of you. The way you stood up for yourself, the way you fought back, even when it cost you. That's took the kind of courage he always said you had." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to help you sooner. I'm sorry I let fear make me weak." I hugged her there on the sidewalk, this woman who'd failed me and loved me in equal measure, and felt some of the anger I'd been carrying start to loosen its grip. "I know, Mum," I whispered. "I know you are." When I got home that night, there was a FedEx envelope waiting on my doorstep. Inside was a handwritten letter from Richard on his company letterhead. "Stephanie, you've won your battle, but battles end. Lives continue. I have a proposal that I think will interest you. Something that will take Silverline to the next level. Something that will help thousands more people than we're reaching now. Something that will transform what you've built from a successful startup into a lasting legacy. Meet me in Seattle next Tuesday. I'll send a plane. Trust me on this one last thing. The real part of your life is about to begin. Richard." I read the letter 3 times, then looked around my small apartment at the life I'd rebuilt from nothing. I thought about my father's words in his letter, "Make yourself proud." I picked up my phone and texted Richard, "I'll be there." The plane Richard sent was absurdly luxurious leather seats, a flight attendant who brought me coffee in actual China Cups Wi-Fi that actually worked. I spent the 3-hour flight to Seattle working on Silverline's user interface updates, trying not to think too hard about what kind of proposal required a private jet and a cryptic letter about my life beginning. Richard met me at Boeing Field in a Tesla that probably cost more than my first apartment. We drove through Seattle's grey drizzle to a waterfront restaurant where he'd reserved a private room overlooking Puget Sound, and over salmon that melted on the tongue and wine I couldn't pronounce, he laid out his vision. "Silverline is successful," he said, "but it's operating at maybe 10% of its potential. You're running it like a startup, scrappy, lean, reactive. What if we transformed it into something bigger? A foundation with real resources, national reach, the ability to deploy your technology to nursing homes, community centres, anywhere seniors need help." He pulled out a folder thick with projections and strategic plans. "I want to invest $5 million. Not as a loan, not for equity, as a gift to a non-profit foundation dedicated to senior wellness technology. I want you to lead it, build it, make it your father's legacy and yours." I stared at him speechless. $5 million for a non-profit, no strings attached except the imperative to do good. "Why?" I finally managed. "Because your father saved my life in Vietnam, and I never got to thank him," Richard said simply. "And because I've watched you for the past year, and I've seen someone who doesn't just want to win, she wants to help. That's rare. That's worth investing in." I said yes before I'd fully thought it through, before I'd considered the logistics or the implications. I said yes because it felt like the answer to the question I'd been asking myself since the trial. Ended, what comes next? What came next was work. Beautiful, exhausting, meaningful work. I spent 3 months restructuring Silverline from a for-profit startup into a properly established foundation with a board and mission statement and the kind of organisational backbone that could support real growth. And when it came time to choose where to headquarter this new incarnation, I didn't pick Boston or San Francisco or Seattle. I picked Wilson Creek, Oregon. The town where I'd worked night shifts for $12 an hour, where I'd learned what seniors actually needed by spending time with them in their loneliest hours, where I'd saved Agnes Chen's life without knowing her son would one day save mine. We found a small building on Main Street that had been a hardware store before the owner retired and the space sat empty. I renovated it myself, wow, I hired contractors, but I was there every day, making sure they installed the ramp at the right angle for wheelchairs, making sure the lighting was warm instead of the harsh fluorescence that hurt elderly eyes, making sure there was a comfortable waiting area with coffee and magazines for the seniors who'd be visiting for training sessions. When it came time to hire staff, I remembered what it felt like to be discarded, forgotten, told I wasn't enough. So I sought out people who'd been overlooked, women in their 50s who'd been pushed out of tech jobs by younger workers, seniors who wanted meaningful part-time work instead of retirement boredom, former teachers and social workers who understood that technology was just a tool for connection, not an end in itself. Maria, my former co-worker from Sunset Gardens, became my director of operations. She hired Betty, the woman who'd rented me a room when I first arrived in Wilson Creek, to run our community outreach program. We put up a sign in the window, Silverline Foundation, everyone deserves a second chance. And slowly, day by day, I started to feel like I was building something real. Not a company designed to make investors rich, but a mission that would outlive me. We distributed free tablets to seniors who couldn't afford them. We ran training sessions every Tuesday and Thursday, where older adults could come learn how to use the app in a patient, judgment-free environment. We partnered with local nursing homes to integrate Silverline into their care systems. The peace I'd been searching for didn't come from the courtroom victory, or the money, or the vindication. It came on evening walks through Wilson Creek with seniors who'd become my friends, who'd stop me on the street to show me photos of their grandchildren. They'd learn to text, who'd tell me stories about the emergency response feature saving their neighbour, or the medication reminders keeping them independent. It came from knowing that the work I did today would help someone tomorrow, and that was enough. 6 months after opening the Wilson Creek headquarters, on a Tuesday afternoon when rain was drumming against the windows and I was reviewing grant applications, someone knocked on my office door. I looked up expecting Maria or one of the volunteers, and instead saw my sister standing in the doorway. Melissa looked different from the last time I'd seen her in the courtroom 8 months ago. She'd gained weight, not in a bad way, but in a way that made her look softer, less sharp-edged. It took me a moment to realise she was pregnant, maybe 6 or 7 months along her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. And beside her, clutching her other hand, was Sophie, now 4 years old, with Melissa's eyes and my father's mouth staring at me, with an expression that was part curiosity, part fear. "Sister," Melissa said, and her voice cracked on the word. "Can we talk?" I sat frozen in my chair, a dozen emotions colliding in my chest. Anger that she'd dare show up here. Curiosity about why she'd come. Grief for what we'd lost. And underneath it all, something that might have been hope, though I wasn't sure for what. Sophie's eyes were wide and frightened the way children look when they don't understand why the adults around them are so tense. She was wearing a purple jacket with a unicorn on it and clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. I could have said no. I could have asked her to leave. I'd earned the right to that boundary after everything she'd done. But I looked at Sophie's frightened face and remembered my father's voice from his letter, "Do what's right, even if it costs you." I remembered him saying once when I was young and fighting with Melissa over something stupid, "Family is where we learn to forgive, sweetheart. Not because they deserve it, but because you deserve to be free." I took a deep breath. I gestured to the chairs across from my desk. Melissa hesitated, then sat down slowly, carefully, the way pregnant women do when their centre of gravity has shifted. Sophie climbed into the chair beside her mother, the stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest, her legs swinging because they didn't quite reach the floor. "I don't know where to start," Melissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Start with why you're here," I said, keeping my tone neutral. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. Melissa's hands were shaking as she clasped them over her belly. "I'm here because I need to say things I should have said years ago. And because," her voice broke, "because I don't want my daughter to grow up thinking that betraying people you love is acceptable. I don't want her to become what I became." Sophie was watching her mother with wide, worried eyes. I softened my voice slightly. "Sophie, honey, there's a box of crayons and paper in that cabinet behind you. Would you like to draw while your mum and I talk?" She looked to Melissa for permission, and when my sister nodded, Sophie slid off the chair and went to the cabinet, giving us a small measure of privacy. "I was jealous of you my entire life," Melissa said once Sophie was occupied. "From the time we were kids, Dad loved you more. He didn't even try to hide it. You were the smart one, the brave one, the one he'd stay up late, talking to about ideas and dreams. And me, I was just the pretty one. That's all I ever heard. Melissa is so pretty!" Like that was my only value. Tears were sliding down her face now. When Derek came along and told me I could be more than that I could be a founder, a businesswoman, someone important, I wanted it so badly, I didn't care what it cost. "It cost me everything," I said quietly. "I know." She was crying harder now. And I told myself I didn't have a choice, that Derek was in control, that Mom needed me to go along with it. But that was a lie I told myself, so I wouldn't have to face what I really was, a coward who stole from her own sister because she was too weak to build something herself. "You had choices, Melissa." My voice was colder than I intended, but I couldn't help it. The anger was still there, buried under months of trying to move forward. When Derek asked you to help him, you could have said no. When you saw the cooperation agreement Mum pressured me to sign, you could have spoken up. When you stood beside him at that gala 5 years ago and let him take credit for my work, you could have told the truth. Every single time you chose the easy path. You chose your comfort over my dignity. She nodded, not defending herself, just accepting the truth of it. "You're right. I made those choices. And I've lived with them every day since. I watched you disappear, literally disappear from Boston, from our lives, and I told myself it was for the best, that you were better off, away from Derek, that I was protecting you somehow. But I was really just protecting myself from having to admit what I'd done." "Why did you testify?" I asked. It was the question I'd been holding since the trial. "Why did you finally tell the truth?" Melissa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Because I was sitting in that courtroom listening to Derek, like watching him destroy Mum on the stand, and I realised Sophie was going to grow up thinking this was normal, that this was what family looked like. And I couldn't," she broke off sobbing, "I couldn't let her think that love meant silence, that loyalty meant complicity. I had to show her that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong, even when it costs you everything." We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound Sophie's crayons scratching against paper and the rain against the windows. "I'm not here asking for forgiveness," Melissa finally said. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking, begging for you not to let Sophie grow up without knowing her aunt. She's innocent in all this, and I want her to know that there's a woman in her family who stood up for herself, who fought back, who didn't let anyone make her small. I want her to grow up with you as an example of strength, not me as an example of weakness." Something in me cracked at that. I looked over at Sophie, carefully colouring a picture of what might have been a flower or might have been a dragon. It was hard to tell, and I thought about my father's words, about family being where we learn to forgive. But I also thought about 5 years of poverty and shame, about my father dying without seeing his investment honoured, about my mother's guilt-ridden face in the hospital. I thought about all the damage Melissa's silence had caused, and I wasn't sure forgiveness was something I had to give. "I can't just erase what happened," I said carefully. "I can't pretend it didn't hurt. And I'm not ready to call us sisters again and act like everything's fine." "I understand," Melissa whispered. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a business card for a program I'd recently partnered with a non-profit that provided housing and support services for single mothers in crisis. "You need real help, professional help, not from me." I handed her the card. They can get you into transitional housing, help you apply for assistance, connect you with job training programs. She took the card with shaking hands, nodded. I pulled out another piece of paper, a blank application form for Silverline Foundation. And if you're serious about changing, about becoming someone Sophie can be proud of, you can fill this out. We have an opening for an administrative assistant, $15 an hour, answering phones, filing data entry, basic office work. Hours are 9 to 3, so you can pick Sophie up from preschool. I met her eyes. It's not charity, you'd be working, earning it. And if you can't handle it, if you miss shifts or cause problems, you're gone. No family favours. You understand. Melissa stared at the application like it was a life raft. You'd hire me after everything. I'd give you a chance to prove you can change, I corrected. Whether you take it or waste it is up to you. Monday morning 9 a.m. if you want it. She pressed the paper to her chest and sobbed. Thank you, God. Thank you, Stephanie. I'll show you. Don't show me, I interrupted gently. Show Sophie, show yourself. That's what matters. After they left, Sophie clutching the dragonflower picture she'd drawn for me, Melissa holding the application, and the support program card like they were made of gold, Maria appeared in my doorway with her arms crossed and a skeptical expression. You sure about that? She asked, nodding toward where Melissa had been sitting. After what she did to you? I leaned back in my chair, feeling exhausted and uncertain, and oddly hopeful all at once. No, I'm not sure at all. I don't trust her. I don't know if she'll actually show up Monday, and if she does, I don't know if she'll last a week. Then why offer her a job? I thought about Richard giving me a chance when I had nothing, about Agnes's son waiting years for my phone call because his mother had told him to help me, about Marcus taking my case because I'd held an old woman's hand in a hospital, about my father investing his last $15,000 in a dream everyone else called foolish. Because someone once believed in second chances enough to give me one, I said quietly, and if I've learned anything from building this place, it's that people can change if they're given the chance and the support to do it. Maybe Melissa will waste this opportunity. Maybe she'll disappoint me again. But if I don't at least give her the chance, I'm no better than the people who wrote me off as a failure. Maria studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Your dad would have said the same thing. After she left, I sat alone in my office, watching the rain and wondering if I'd just made a terrible mistake, or the right choice for the wrong reasons, or maybe somehow both at once. I didn't know if this was right, but somewhere I thought my father might be proud that I was at least trying. Melissa showed up Monday morning at 8:55, wearing clothes that were clean but clearly bought secondhand, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her pregnant belly prominent under a loose blouse. She looked terrified, like she expected me to tell her I'd changed my mind, that the job offer had been a cruel joke. Instead, I handed her a stack of filing and showed her how to use the database system for tracking volunteer hours. She took notes, carefully asked questions when she didn't understand, and worked steadily through the day without complaint. At 3 o'clock, she packed up her things, thanked me quietly, and left to pick up Sophie from preschool. She came back Tuesday, and Wednesday, and every day for the next 3 weeks. I watched her from a distance, keeping our interactions professional and minimal. I saw her arrive early some mornings to catch up on work she hadn't finished the day before. I noticed her staying late one evening to help Maria organise the supply closet, even though it wasn't her responsibility. I overheard her on the phone with a confused elderly caller, patiently explaining for the third time how to reset their password, her voice gentle and kind in a way I remembered from when we were young before Derek, before everything broke. One afternoon, I saw her teaching Sophie to count using the Silverline app on break time, showing her daughter how the big buttons and clear labels made it easy for Grandma Ellen's friends to stay connected with their families. Sophie was giggling, pressing buttons, and watching the animations, and Melissa was smiling a real smile, not the brittle social smile she'd worn at the gala years ago. I didn't soften toward her exactly. I didn't let her into my life beyond the boundaries of employer and employee. but I noticed her trying, and something about that mattered in ways I wasn't ready to examine too closely. Then, 5 weeks after Melissa started working for me, my mother suffered a second stroke. The call came at 2 a.m, a nurse from Mass General Hospital, saying Ellen Cooper had been brought in by ambulance, that she'd collapsed in her kitchen and had been unresponsive for an unknown period before a neighbour found her. I was on the road to Boston within 20 minutes, and when I arrived at the ICU, Melissa was already there, still in her pyjamas with a coat thrown over them. Sophie asleep in the waiting room chair, wrapped in a blanket. They said it's bad. Melissa told me, her face grey with fear. Worse than the first one. They don't know if she'll wake up. We took turns sitting with her, one of us always in the room, while the other watched Sophie or tried to sleep in the uncomfortable waiting room chairs. The doctors talked to us about brain damage, about quality of life, about the possibility that even if she woke up, she might not be the person we remembered. But 3 days after admission, my mother opened her eyes. She couldn't move her right side, and her speech was slurred, but she was conscious and aware. When she saw both of us standing by her bedside, tears rolled down her cheeks. "My girls," she managed to whisper. "Both. Here." "We're here. Mum," I said, taking her left hand, the one that still worked. Over the following week, she improved marginally. She'd never walk again, the doctors said. She'd need full-time care. But she could speak, could think, could still be present, even if her body was failing her. One evening, when Melissa had taken Sophie home for the night and I was alone with my mother, she gestured for me to come closer. Her voice was weak but determined. "Need to tell you," she said slowly. "Proud, always proud of you." "I know, Mum." "No." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Listen, you were my pride, always, just didn't have courage to say it. Scared. You didn't need me." I pressed my forehead against her hand, tears coming fast. "I always needed you, Mum. I still need you. Melissa needs more," she whispered. "But you were always enough. More than," she struggled for breath. "Protect each other. Family. All you have left." She died 4 days later, quietly in the early morning hours, with both daughters holding her hands. The funeral was small, just Melissa, Sophie, me, Richard, Marcus, Maria, and a handful of neighbours who remembered my mother from before our family imploded. We buried her next to my father in the plot they'd purchased together 30 years ago, and I stood between them, thinking about how we spend our lives trying to make our parents proud, only to realise too late that they were already proud, they just didn't know how to say it. Cleaning out my mother's house fell to both of us. Melissa and I worked in careful silence, packing up decades of accumulated life, deciding what to keep and what to donate. In my mother's bedroom dresser, underneath her winter sweaters, I found a file folder I'd never seen before. Inside were legal documents establishing a scholarship fund, $50,000 from her life insurance policy set up 2 years earlier, around the time of the trial. The fund was named the David and Ellen Cooper Grant for Women in Technology Who Were Silenced. There was a handwritten note in my mother's shaky script. "For people like Stephanie. For those who deserve to be heard but aren't. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. This is all I can do now." I held the papers in shaking hands and called for Melissa. She came into the bedroom and I showed her silently, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "She tried," Melissa whispered. "She was trying to make it right." We sat together on our mother's bed, surrounded by half-packed boxes, and cried for the mother who'd failed us and loved us and failed us again, who'd made terrible choices out of fear, but had tried in her limited way to atone. That night, alone in my apartment, I looked at the scholarship documents and made a decision. I'd combine my mother's $50,000 with $200,000 of my settlement money. I'd create something bigger than either of us could have managed alone, A real, substantial scholarship for women who'd been pushed out, stolen from, silenced. Women like I had been. And the first recipient I thought might be my own sister. If she wanted it, if she earned it, if she proved she could transform from the person who'd helped destroy me into someone capable of helping others. I didn't know if that was wisdom or foolishness, but it felt like what my father would have wanted and what my mother had been trying to say with her last gift. Family, for all its failures and betrayals, was where we learned to be better than we'd been. 3 months after we buried our mother, the National Technology Council called to tell me I'd been selected for their Social Innovation Award. It was one of those honours that came with a keynote speech, a crystal trophy, national press coverage and validation from the people whose opinions supposedly mattered. They wanted me in Washington, D.C. in 2 weeks to accept it in front of 2,000 tech leaders and policymakers. I said yes because it seemed like the kind of thing you were supposed to say yes to, because Silverline deserved the recognition, because it would help our mission to have that kind of visibility. But as the date approached, I felt increasingly disconnected from the whole thing, like I was watching someone else's life from the outside. The night before I was supposed to fly to DC, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the speech I'd prepared, a professional, polished thing about innovation and perseverance, and the importance of designing technology with empathy. It was fine. It was good, even. But it felt hollow, like I was performing the role of a successful founder instead of being one. At midnight, I gave up on sleep, got dressed and got in my car. I didn't have a destination in mind, but my hands seemed to know where they were going, steering me through the quiet streets of Wilson Creek to the building that had once housed Sunset Gardens Senior Living Centre. It was empty now, had been for over a year since Silver Connect had bought and closed it. The parking lot was cracked and weedy, the windows dark, the sign hanging crooked. I parked in my old spot near the back entrance and sat there looking at the place where I'd worked for $12 an hour, where I'd felt like the smallest, most invisible version of myself. But also where I'd saved Agnes Chen's life, where I'd found meaning in simple acts of kindness, where I'd learned that worth wasn't measured in salary or title or recognition, but in whether you showed up for people who needed you. I got out of the car and walked around to the main entrance, and that's when I saw the light in what used to be the staff break room. Someone was inside. My first thought was to call the police, but then I recognized the silhouette moving past the window. Maria. I knocked on the glass door, and she jumped, then laughed when she saw it was me. She came and unlocked it, pulling me into a hug that smelled like the same cheap perfume she'd worn when we worked together. "What are you doing here?" I asked, stepping into the familiar space that looked strange in abandonment, empty medication carts, dust-covered furniture walls still bearing the cheerful murals we'd painted for the residents. "Same thing you are probably," Maria said, settling onto one of the old couches. Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about this place, about the people we helped here. Thought I'd come say goodbye properly before they tear it down next month for that condo development. She patted the cushion beside her. "You're supposed to be getting ready for your big award tomorrow. What are you really doing here?" I sat down and the cushion exhaled dust. "I don't know. I have this speech prepared all about how I fought back and won and built something meaningful. But when I practice it, it feels like I'm lying. Not about the facts, but about what it all means." "What does it mean?" Maria asked in that direct way she had that cut-through pretense. "That's what I can't figure out," I admitted. I spent 5 years believing that if I could just prove I wasn't a failure, if I could just make everyone see the truth, I'd finally feel okay about myself. And I won. I proved it. Everyone knows the truth now. Silverline is successful. Derek's in prison. I have money recognition, all of it. I press my palms against my eyes. So why do I still feel like something's missing? Maria was quiet for a moment, then said gently, "Maybe because you were asking the wrong question all along." "What do you mean? You kept trying to prove you weren't a failure. But who said you were in the first place?" She turned to look at me. Derek said it. Your sister said it. Your mum didn't contradict it. But they don't get to decide that, Stephanie. They never did. The only person whose opinion actually matters is yours, and you gave them that power. You let them define your worth. The words hit me like a physical blow because they were true. I'd spent 5 years fighting Derek and Melissa, but the real battle had been with myself. The real enemy had been the voice in my head that agreed with them, that said maybe they were right, maybe I wasn't enough, maybe I deserved what happened. I hurt myself more than they ever hurt me, I whispered. I believed them. That was the real damage. And now, Maria asked, do you still believe them? I thought about the last year, about building Silver Line, about the lives saved, about giving Melissa a second chance, about establishing the scholarship in my parents' names. I thought about the work I did every day that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone, and everything to do with helping people who needed help. No, I said slowly, I don't believe them anymore. I don't need them to acknowledge what I built because I know what I built. I don't need their approval because I approve of myself. I laughed, a sound that was half sob. God, that sounds so simple. How did it take me this long to figure that out? Because you're human, Maria said, squeezing my hand. And humans are complicated. We get lost in other people's stories about us. Takes a while to remember we get to write our own. I sat there in that abandoned building where I'd once felt so small, and I understood finally what Richard had been trying to tell me months ago. Recognition hadn't made me whole because I'd never been broken. I just believed I was. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app where I'd saved my speech. I deleted it all 3 pages of carefully crafted professionalism and started writing something new, something true. When I finished, it was nearly 2 a.m. I walked Maria to her car, hugged her goodbye, and then sat in my own car with my phone in my hand staring at Melissa's number. I called before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep and worry. Stephanie, what's wrong? Is Sophie okay? Sophie's fine. Everyone's fine. I took a breath. I needed to tell you something. At 2 a.m. But her tone was more concerned than annoyed. Thank you for betraying me, I said, and felt the truth of it as I spoke. I mean it. Thank you for letting Derek steal my company. Thank you for staying silent. Thank you for calling me a liar on television. There was a long silence, then quietly, I don't understand. If you hadn't done all of that, I would never have learned to stand up for myself. I would have kept being the version of me that needed everyone's approval, that made herself small to keep others comfortable. I would have spent my whole life waiting for someone to save me, instead of learning to save myself. My voice cracked. You hurt me. You really, really hurt me. But in breaking me, you also freed me. And I needed to tell you that before I stand on that stage tomorrow and pretend it was all about winning, when really, it was about finding out I didn't need to win. I just needed to stop losing myself. I heard her crying soft and broken. I don't deserve your gratitude. No, I agreed. You don't, but I'm not giving it for you. I'm giving it for me because I'm done carrying anger that only hurts me. You did a terrible thing, and somehow, accidentally, it led me exactly where I needed to be. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'll never stop being sorry. I know, I said, and I'm learning to live with that. Maybe someday I'll even forgive you completely. But right now this is enough. After we hung up, I sat in the parking lot of my old workplace and watched the sky begin to lighten with dawn. Tomorrow, I'd fly to Washington. I'd stand on that stage. I'd accept an award for innovation and social impact. But the real award, the one that mattered, I'd just given myself. The knowledge that I was enough, that I'd always been enough, and that no one could ever take that away from me again. I flew to Washington the next morning, wearing the navy blue dress I'd worn to that first gala, where Richard had recognized me, and on my wrist my father's watch. I'd had it repaired months ago, new crystal, new battery, the hands reset and working again. But I'd asked the jeweller to leave the old scratches on the case, the dents from when it had hit the sidewalk. The damage was part of its story now, part of mine. The ceremony was held in the grand ballroom of the Smithsonian, all marble columns and soaring ceilings, and the kind of grandeur designed to make you feel simultaneously important and very small. 2,000 people filled the seats: tech CEOs, government officials, academics, journalists. The kind of crowd that would have terrified me a year ago. Now I looked at them and felt only a quiet certainty about what I wanted to say. Richard found me in the green room before the ceremony started. He took one look at my face and smiled. "You figured it out," he said, not a question. "I figured it out," I confirmed. "Good, your father would be proud." When my name was called and I walked across that stage to accept the Crystal Award, the applause was thunderous. I looked out at the sea of faces and felt grateful, but not dependent on their approval. That was the difference between this moment and the gala 8 months ago. Then I'd needed them to see me. Now I was simply letting them see what was already there. I set the award on the podium and pulled out the handwritten notes I'd made at 2 a.m. in the parking lot of Sunset Gardens. "Thank you for this honour," I began. "I've prepared remarks about innovation and technology and the importance of designing with empathy, but I'm not going to give that speech because I realised last night that the real story isn't about any of those things. It's about something much simpler and much harder." I paused, looking down at my father's watch, then back up at the audience. 7 years ago, I had a dream to create technology that would help elderly people stay connected and safe. 5 years ago, someone stole that dream, and I let them, because I believed what they told me, that I wasn't smart enough, wasn't capable enough, wasn't enough, period. I spent 5 years working minimum wage jobs in a town where nobody knew my name, and I convinced myself that's what I deserved. The room was absolutely silent. And then something shifted. Not because I won a lawsuit, though I did. Not because my app became successful, though it did. It shifted because I finally asked myself a question I should have asked years earlier: who gave them the right to define my worth? I pressed my hand against my chest. The answer was me. I gave them that power. And the moment I took it back, the moment I decided that I was enough, regardless of what anyone else thought, that's when everything changed. I looked out at the audience. Seeing faces is reflecting surprise, recognition, emotion. Success isn't when others acknowledge you. Success is when you don't need that acknowledgement anymore. When you can look in the mirror and respect the person looking back, regardless of whether you have awards or money or recognition. I gestured to the room. This is wonderful, and I'm grateful. But my real success happened 6 months ago in a nursing home in Oregon, when an 82-year-old woman told me she could finally video call her grandchildren without getting confused by the buttons. That's when I knew I'd built something that mattered. I pulled out my phone and opened the statistics dashboard. To date, Silverline has been used by 143,000 people. Our AI fall detection system has successfully identified and responded to 1,247 serious falls, getting emergency help to people who might otherwise have died alone. I looked up. 1,247 lives. That's not fame. That's not validation. That's just people who are still alive because of work that started with a simple question. What if technology was designed for everyone, not just people who grew up with it? My voice broke slightly. So, if anyone in this room is where I was 5 years ago, feeling erased, feeling invisible, feeling like you're not enough, hear me when I say you don't need permission to exist. You don't need anyone to validate your worth. You just need to believe in yourself enough to start. The courage comes later. The recognition comes later. Or maybe it doesn't come at all. But the work, the real, meaningful work that changes lives, that happens when you decide you matter, regardless of who agrees. The standing ovation started before I finished speaking and lasted for what felt like forever. People were crying, nodding, some holding their hands over their hearts. I stood at that podium feeling not triumph, but peace, the kind that comes from finally saying the truth you've been afraid to speak. Afterward, there was a reception with champagne and networking and people wanting to shake my hand, take photos, talk about partnerships and investments. I moved through it gracefully. Grateful but not grasping, present but not dependent. Richard stayed close, running interference when people got too intense, until finally the crowd thinned and I could breathe. I was standing near the coat check ready to leave when an elderly woman approached me. She was maybe 70, with silver hair and kind eyes, clutching my hand with surprising strength. "Ms. Cooper," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I needed to find you. I needed to thank you. Your app saved my mother's life." I smiled, used to these stories, now each one precious. "I'm so glad it helped. How old is your mother?" 86. She lives alone in a small apartment in Maryland, very independent, very stubborn. The woman laughed wetly. 3 months ago, she had a fall in her kitchen. Hit her head, couldn't get up, couldn't reach her phone. But your app, it detected the fall automatically and called 911. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes. The doctors said if she'd been alone any longer, the head injury would have killed her. "That's exactly what it's designed for," I said warmly. "I'm so happy she's okay." "She's more than okay. She's thriving. And she wanted me to tell you if I ever met you that you gave her more time with her family. More time to meet her newest great-grandchild." The woman squeezed my hand. "Her name is Ellen Cooper." The world seemed to tilt. "I'm sorry, what name did you say?" "Ellen Cooper. My mother. Your app saved Ellen Cooper's life." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear over it. "Ellen Cooper," I repeated stupidly. "From Maryland." "Yes, from Silver Spring. Do you know her?" "No, I had to sit down. Richard materialized with a chair, his hand on my shoulder. "That was my mother's name, Ellen Cooper. She died 4 months ago." The woman's face filled with sympathy. "Oh, I'm so sorry. What a coincidence. But maybe that makes it even more meaningful, that your technology saved someone with your mother's name." I nodded, unable to speak, and the woman hugged me and moved on, not realizing she'd just collapsed my entire understanding of the universe. Richard crouched beside my chair. "You okay?" "My app saved someone named Ellen Cooper," I whispered. "Richard, what are the odds? In a country of 300 million people, higher than you'd think." But he was looking at me with something like wonder. "Or maybe your father's watching out for you in his own way." I sat there in that emptying ballroom, holding my father's repaired watch, and thought about the circles we travel, the strange grace of coincidence, and the possibility that sometimes the universe gives us exactly the sign we need to know we're on the right path. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this, something I was missing. As soon as I got back to my hotel room, I pulled up the Silverline database on my laptop, my hands trembling as I logged in with administrator access. I searched for Ellen Cooper in the emergency response records. 2 results appeared. One was the woman from Silver Spring, Maryland, the one whose daughter had just thanked me. Emergency call placed 3 months ago. Full detected, ambulance dispatched. The other was from Boston, Massachusetts. 9 months ago. My breath stopped. I clicked on the record and there it was. My mother's address, the one I'd grown up in. Emergency call placed at 4:37 a.m. Not a full detection. A cardiac irregularity alert. The system had detected an abnormal heart rhythm pattern and automatically contacted emergency services, listing it as a potential cardiac event. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called Melissa. She answered on the second ring, sounding worried. "Stephanie, are you okay? How did the ceremony go?" "Melissa, when Mum had her second stroke, the one that hospitalised her, do you remember how the ambulance knew to come?" "I what? Why are you asking about that now? Please just answer. Did she call them herself?" "No, she couldn't have. The paramedics said when they arrived she was already unconscious. Her neighbour heard the sirens and came over, found the door unlocked, and Mum on the floor." "Why?" My heart was pounding. "Did Mum have Silverline installed on her phone?" There was a long pause. "Yes, I'd installed it for her after Dad died because she was living alone and I was worried. But she barely used it, said she didn't understand all the features." Another pause. "Why, Stephanie?" "What's going on? Check the emergency contact list in her account. I'm sending you the login." I heard typing, then a sharp intake of breath. "Oh my God, what?" "The system shows an automatic emergency call placed at 4:37 a.m. on the morning Mum had her stroke. Cardiac irregularity detected. It called 911, automatically gave them the address, unlocked the front door remotely using the smart lock integration." Her voice broke. "Stephanie, the paramedics got there in 8 minutes. The doctors told me later that if they'd arrived even 10 minutes later, the lack of oxygen to her brain she wouldn't have woken up at all." I pressed my hand over my mouth, tears streaming down my face. "I saved her. I saved Mum, and I didn't even know." "You gave us those last 3 weeks with her," Melissa whispered. "She got to tell us she loved us. She got to see Sophie one more time. She got to make peace." She was crying now too. "Sister, you gave us the chance to say goodbye." I sat on the hotel bed sobbing, not from grief, but from the overwhelming sense that everything had come full circle. My mother, who'd once doubted my dream, had trusted it with her life, maybe without even realising it. She downloaded my app, and in her moment of greatest need, it had been there for her, the way I hadn't been able to be. The next morning, I drove to the cemetery where my parents were buried. I knelt between their headstones, running my fingers over my father's name, then my mother's. "Dad," I whispered. "I kept my promise. And Mum. Mum, you used what I built. You trusted it, even if you never said so. You believed in me through action when words were too hard. Thank you for that." I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Melissa walking up the path, Sophie holding her hand. Melissa was 8 months pregnant now, moving slowly, one hand supporting her back. When she reached me, she didn't say anything, just stood beside me looking down at our parents' graves. Sophie broke the silence. "Mama says Grandma and Grandpa are in heaven watching us." "I think they are," I said, kneeling to Sophie's level. "And I think they're proud of all of us." Melissa's voice was quiet. "I want Sophie to know her aunt, not as someone I work for, but as family, the woman who didn't abandon us even when we abandoned her." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Can we try, really try?" I stood up and looked at my sister, really looked at her. I saw someone trying, someone changing, someone who'd made terrible choices but was working every day to become someone different. I saw my father's determination in her jaw and my mother's fear and courage mixed together. "Let's go home," I said, and meant it. For the first time in 7 years, I called her sister, not Melissa, not my sister, but just sister, the way we used to when we were young. And I knew somewhere beyond sight our parents were smiling. Our family had finally found the way home. But there was more work to do. There was always more work to do. The work of rebuilding a family was slow and uncomfortable and necessary. Melissa continued working at Silverline, and slowly our conversations moved beyond professional pleasantries into something more real. We started having lunch together once a week, usually with Sophie chattering between us about preschool or her baby brother who was coming soon. We didn't talk much about the past that Wound was still too raw, too complex to examine directly. Instead, we talked about the future, about the kind of family we wanted Sophie to grow up in, about the kind of women we wanted to become. And I thought a lot about my mother's scholarship fund, about her attempt to make amends, about the $50,000 she'd set aside for women whose voices had been silenced. It wasn't enough, I realised. Not because the amount was small, but because the need was so vast. I called Richard and Marcus to help me structure something bigger. We combined my mother's $50,000 with $250,000 from my settlement money, then added another $200,000 from Richard's foundation. $500,000 to create the Cooper Innovation Grant $25,000 scholarships for 20 women per year who'd faced discrimination, theft, or silencing in their entrepreneurial journeys. The application asked for their story, their current project, and what they'd do with the support. We didn't require degrees or credentials or business plans that fit a certain mould. We just required that they'd been knocked down and were trying to get back up. The launch ceremony was held at Silverline's headquarters in Wilson Creek on a clear Saturday in late spring. We'd invited the local press, some tech journalists, representatives from women's business organisations. About 80 people filled the small space spilling out onto the sidewalk. I stood at the front with the oversized ceremonial ribbon stretched across our doorway, and I invited Melissa to stand beside me holding the other end. She looked at me with surprise and uncertainty. "This is about second chances," I said quietly, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "About believing people can change, can grow, can become more than their worst moments. My sister and I, we've hurt each other. We've failed each other. But we're here together because we're choosing to be better than we were." I held out the scissors. "Will you help me cut the ribbon?" Melissa's eyes filled with tears. She took the scissors and together we cut through the ribbon. The small crowd applauded, but all I could see was my sister's face, the way she was looking at me like I'd given her something precious and fragile, that she was terrified of breaking. After the ceremony, we hugged, really hugged for the first time since we were teenagers. "Thank you for believing I can change," she whispered against my shoulder. "Thank you for actually changing," I whispered back. The applications started coming in immediately. By the end of the first week, we had 547 submissions from 42 states. Women who'd had their ideas stolen by business partners. Women who'd been pushed out of companies they'd founded. Women whose ex-husbands had taken credit for their work. Women of colour whose contributions had been erased by white colleagues. Immigrant women whose language barriers had been exploited. I read every single application, staying up late into the night, my laptop screen glowing in the darkness. Each story was a variation on the same theme: someone had taken what wasn't theirs, and these women were fighting to reclaim not just their ideas, but their sense of self. I thought I was the only one application read. I thought I was the only one, said another, and another, and another. "You're not alone," I whispered to the screen. "None of us are alone." On a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after applications closed, I was reviewing the finalists when I came across a submission that made my hand freeze on the mouse. The name at the top, Melissa Cooper. I almost skipped it, assuming it was someone else with the same name, but then I saw the address, my sister's address. I opened the full application with shaking hands. Project description: Sophie's Light Mental Health Centre for Single Mothers. I want to create a space where women who've lost everything, their marriages, their careers, their sense of self, can find support, counselling and community. I want to help them rebuild not just their lives, but their belief that they deserve good things. Personal statement: 7 years ago, I made choices that destroyed my sister's life and my own integrity. I stole from her, lied about her, stood by, while someone else took credit for her brilliance. I did it because I was jealous, weak, and desperate to matter. For years, I told myself I had no choice, but that was a lie. I had choices. I just made terrible ones. I'm not applying for this scholarship because I deserve it. I'm applying because I want to become someone who does. I want my daughter to grow up seeing her mother as someone who made mistakes, but spent the rest of her life trying to make amends. I want to be worthy of my sister's forgiveness. I want to be worthy of my own name. This isn't about the past. It's about who I'm becoming. And I hope that's someone my father would have been proud of. I sat at my desk crying, reading it 3 times, feeling something complicated and painful and hopeful unfold in my chest. The selection committee would never have to see this application. I could quietly reject it, tell Melissa later that she wasn't selected, save us both the awkwardness. Or I could do what this entire foundation was built on, believe in second chances. I clicked approved and added a note in the system. This scholarship isn't about past. It's about future. Congratulations, sister. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. Melissa's name on the screen. When I answered, all I could hear was crying. "I'll make you proud," she finally managed to say. "I swear, Stephanie, I'll make you so proud." "You already are," I said, and meant it. Melissa used the scholarship money to rent a small house on the outskirts of Wilson Creek, a 3-bedroom place with peeling paint and a yard full of weeds, but good bones underneath. She painted the walls herself, soft blues and greens that research said were calming, while 8 months pregnant, refusing help because, as she told me, I need to build this with my own hands. Sophie's Light opened 2 weeks after Melissa's son was born. She named him David, after our father, and brought him to the centre in a carrier strapped to her chest, while she ran intake appointments and facilitated support groups. I watched from a distance, wanting to help, but knowing she needed to do this herself, to prove to herself more than anyone that she was capable. The first month was brutal. Only 3 women showed up to the first support group. Melissa came to work at Silverline the next day, with circles under her eyes, pumping breast milk, in the bathroom during breaks, and I saw her hands shaking as she answered phones. But she didn't quit. She distributed flyers at hospitals and women's shelters. She partnered with local churches. She offered free childcare during group sessions, knowing that was often the barrier that kept women away. Slowly, women started coming. 6 months after opening Sophie's Light had 47 registered participants. 12 had found jobs through the centre's career support program. 23 had secured stable housing. And Melissa ran it all while working part-time at Silverline, caring for a newborn and a 5-year-old looking perpetually exhausted, but also more alive than I'd seen her in years. Then one night she did something I hadn't expected. She wrote it all down. The blog post appeared on Medium on a Tuesday evening, The Sister Who Didn't Abandon Me. I found it because someone tagged me on Twitter, and I read it sitting at my kitchen table with tears streaming down my face. She told the whole story, every bit of it. The jealousy, the betrayal, how she'd let Derek manipulate her because she was desperate to feel important. She described standing on that television set calling me a liar, how she'd felt her soul shrinking even as she nodded along with Derek's words. She wrote about testifying at the trial, about the USB drive in her bracelet, about the months afterward, when she had nothing and no one, and had to face what she'd become. My sister had every right to hate me, she wrote. She had every right to slam the door in my face, to refuse me a job, to deny me the scholarship. But she didn't. She gave me a chance to prove I could be better. Not because I deserved it, but because she understood something. I'm only beginning to grasp that people can change if they're given the support and the space to do so. Sophie's Light exists because my sister believed in second chances when I didn't believe in myself. Every woman who walks through our doors is someone who's been knocked down by life, by circumstances, by the people who are supposed to love them. And I get to tell them what my sister told me. You're not defined by your worst moments. You're defined by what you do next. The post went viral. Within 48 hours, it had 2.3 million views. News outlets picked it up. People shared their own stories of betrayal and forgiveness in the comments. And suddenly, Sophie's Light had a waiting list of women wanting to participate and donors wanting to contribute. Melissa called me sobbing at midnight. I didn't write it for publicity. I needed people to know what you did for me. I know, I said, and I'm proud of you. That was 3 years ago. 3 years in which Sophie's light expanded to 5 locations across Oregon and Washington. 3 years in which Silverline grew to serve over 500,000 seniors. 3 years in which Melissa transformed from someone I worked with into someone I genuinely trusted, slowly, carefully, one consistent action at a time. We had dinner together most Sundays now, our families blending in ways I'd never imagined possible. Sophie was 8, David was 3, and they called me Aunt Stephanie without any hesitation, without knowing that their mother and I had once been so broken we couldn't speak. Richard had become like a second father to both of us, showing up to Sophie's dance recitals and David's birthday parties, telling stories about our father that made him real again. Marcus visited when he was in town, always bringing gifts for the kids and legal advice we didn't always want, but usually needed. It felt like we'd built something real from the wreckage. Not perfect, we still had hard days, moments when old hurts resurfaced, conversations that required careful navigation, but real, solid, worth protecting. So when the cream-coloured envelope arrived at my office with the return address of the Grand Plaza Hotel in Boston, I opened it with curiosity rather than dread. Inside was an invitation on heavy cardstock. The Women in Business Association cordially invites Ms. Stephanie Cooper to receive the Legacy Award for Outstanding Contribution to Social Innovation and Women's Empowerment. The ceremony was in 6 weeks, at the Grand Plaza Hotel, the exact place where this had all begun, where Richard had stood up and asked if I was the founder, where my life had cracked open and been rebuilt. I held the invitation and felt the perfect symmetry of it, the circle closing where it had opened. And I knew exactly who I wanted standing beside me when I walked back into that room. I held the invitation for a long time, running my thumb over the embossed lettering, feeling the weight of 8 years pressing against the present moment. The Grand Plaza Hotel. Table 18 was probably still there in that ballroom, the same spot where I'd sat invisible and humiliated while my family celebrated my erasure. Returning to that place should have filled me with dread or at least complicated emotions. Instead, I felt a strange calm, the kind that comes from knowing you've already survived the worst and came out stronger. I picked up my phone and called Melissa. She answered on the second ring, slightly out of breath. "Hey, sorry, I was chasing David around the yard. What's up? I got invited to receive an award, the Women in Business Legacy Award. It's in 6 weeks. Stephanie, that's amazing. Congratulations, you absolutely deserve it." I took a breath. It's at the Grand Plaza Hotel in Boston, the same ballroom where Derek's gala was, where Richard first recognized me. There was a pause as she absorbed the significance. "Oh, wow, that's a full circle moment." "It is, and I was wondering..." I felt suddenly nervous, uncertain. "Would you come with me, not as my employee or someone I'm obligated to invite, but as my sister?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she was crying. Then her voice came through thick with tears. "You want me there, after everything, standing beside you in that room where we..." "Yes," I said simply. "I want you there. You're part of this story now, not the villain anymore, just my sister." She was definitely crying now. "I'd be honoured. God, Stephanie, I don't even know what to say." "Say you will wear something nice and help me not be nervous." She laughed through her tears. "I can do that. Should I bring Sophie and David?" "Actually, yeah, I think Dad would like that. His grandchildren seeing their aunt receive an award for work he helped start." The 6 weeks passed in a blur of preparation, coordinating with the foundation arranging travel, making sure Silverline and Sophie's light were covered while we were gone. Richard called to say he'd be there, of course, and Marcus was flying in from Boston. Maria insisted on coming, bringing Betty with her. It was becoming less of an awards ceremony and more of a family reunion. The night before the event, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my hotel room in Boston, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had changed. Around 2 a.m, I finally dozed off and dreamed of my father. He was younger in the dream the way he'd looked in old photos from before the war, healthy and strong. We were sitting in his car, overlooking the Charles River thermoses of hot chocolate between us like we used to do when I was a child. "You did good, sweetheart," he said, smiling that smile I'd inherited. "I won, Dad. I got everything back. The company, the recognition, everything you wanted for me." He shook his head gently. "That's not why I'm proud." "Then why?" "Because you stayed kind." He reached over and tapped my chest where my heart was. "You got hurt badly, and you could have let it make you bitter and small. But you didn't. You forgave your mother. You gave your sister a second chance. You built something that helps people instead of just enriching yourself. That's the hardest thing, sweetheart, staying soft when the world tries to make you hard, and you did it. That's what makes me proudest." I woke with tears on my face and a sense of peace I'd been chasing for 8 years. The morning of the ceremony, I opened my closet and pulled out the navy blue dress, the same one I'd worn to Derek's gala 8 years ago, the one I'd worn to the National Technology Council Award. I'd kept it through everything, all the moves, all the changes, all the transformations. It still fit, though I'd gained back the weight I'd lost during those years of poverty and stress, and I looked healthier now, stronger. I put it on and looked in the mirror. Same dress, completely different woman. Melissa knocked on my hotel room door an hour before we needed to leave. She was wearing a green dress I'd helped her pick out her hair done professionally, looking nervous and proud in equal measure. Sophie and David were dressed up too, Sophie in a purple dress with sparkles, and David in a tiny suit that made him look like a miniature businessman. "Ready?" Melissa asked. I picked up my father's watch from the nightstand, the one I wore to every important occasion now, and fastened it around my wrist. "Ready?" We drove to the Grand Plaza Hotel together, Melissa holding my hand in the back seat, while the kids chatted about whether there would be cake at the fancy party. When we pulled up to the entrance, I looked at the building and remembered the last time I'd walked through those doors, invisible and ashamed, believing every terrible thing my family had said about me. Now I walked in with my sister beside me, my chosen family waiting inside, and the certain knowledge that I was enough had always been enough regardless of who saw it. As I walked into that ballroom, the same room with the same layout, and probably even some of the same staff, I wasn't the broken woman at table 18 anymore. I was ready to close the circle, to stand in the place where I'd once been erased, and let everyone see that you can't erase someone who refuses to disappear. The ballroom looked exactly as I remembered. The same crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across white tablecloths, the same stage at the front, the same arrangement of round tables numbered in gold script. Except this time, my name card sat at table 1, right at the centre of the room, not relegated to the shadows by the kitchen doors. Richard found us immediately, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive cologne and the kind of confidence that comes from keeping promises to old war buddies. Marcus was there too with his wife and 2 daughters, and Maria and Betty, looking slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur but thrilled to be included. Before we sat down before the ceremony began, I excused myself and walked to the back of the ballroom. Table 18 was still there, occupied by people I didn't know laughing over glasses of champagne. I stood beside it for a moment, my hand resting on the back of the chair where I'd once sat, feeling invisible. "Thank you," I whispered to my younger self, to the woman who'd survived that night and all the nights that followed. "Thank you for not giving up." "You okay?" Melissa had followed me, was standing a respectful distance away. "I'm perfect," I said, and meant it. The ceremony was beautiful, in the way these things always are, speeches about innovation and leadership, and breaking barriers, videos showcasing the work of Silverline and Sophie's light testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by the technology and support we'd provided. When my name was called and I walked to the stage to accept the award, the applause was genuine and warm, but I didn't need it the way I once would have. I stood at the podium holding the crystal trophy, looking out at 200 faces that included everyone who mattered to me, and I spoke from the heart. 8 years ago, I sat at the back of this exact room, thinking I wasn't worth knowing, thinking that my family was right, that I'd failed, that I deserved to be forgotten. I gestured to table 18. I sat there and let people define me by their limitations, not my possibilities. Tonight, I'm standing here not because I proved them wrong, but because I learned something more important. I didn't need to prove anything. I just needed to believe in myself enough to try. I found Melissa in the audience, saw her crying and smiled. Sometimes family won't see your light until the world does. That's painful and it's unfair. But you can't wait for permission to shine. You can't wait for someone to tell you you're enough. You have to decide you matter and then live like you mean it, even when the people you love most don't understand. I paused, looking around the room. This award has my name on it, but the work behind it belongs to hundreds of people. To my father, who invested his last dollars in a daughter everyone else doubted. To Richard Morrison, who kept a promise to a war buddy by believing in that buddy's daughter. To Marcus Chen, whose mother taught him that kindness creates debts worth repaying. To my sister, who made terrible mistakes, but spent years proving people can change if they're brave enough to try. My voice broke slightly. And to every person who's ever felt erased or invisible or not enough, you are the legacy. You are the reason this work matters. The standing ovation happened before I finished speaking. I walked off stage and directly into Melissa's arms. She held me while we both cried, Sophie tugging at our dresses, wanting to be included, David confused but hugging our legs anyway. "I'm so proud of you," Melissa whispered. "I'm proud of us." I whispered back. Later, after the ceremony ended and people were mingling over dessert and coffee, Sophie tugged my hand and pulled me aside. "Aunt Stephanie, when I grow up, I want to be just like you." I knelt down to her level, looking into eyes that held my father's kindness and my sister's determination. "Sweet girl, don't be like me. Be like yourself. That's the most important thing I can teach you. You don't need to be like anyone else. You just need to be the best version of who you already are." She thought about that seriously, then nodded. "Can I still make apps that help people?" "You can do whatever makes your heart sing," I told her. 7 years later, when I was 46 and Sophie was 15, I received an email that brought all of this rushing back. The subject line read, "I got in," and the message was pure teenage excitement. "Aunt Stephanie, I got accepted to MIT for their computer science program. They said my essay about how you inspired me to pursue technology with empathy was one of the best they'd read. I can't believe this is happening. Thank you for showing me what's possible. Love, Sophie." I sat at my desk reading it 3 times, tears streaming down my face, thinking about circles within circles, about legacy and love, and the ways we save each other without always knowing it. But that was the future. In the present moment, the day after the awards ceremony, I drove Melissa and the kids to the park by the Charles River where my father used to take me. We walked along the path in late afternoon sunshine, Sophie running ahead chasing ducks, while David toddled between us holding both our hands. "I've been thinking," Melissa said quietly, "about starting a second location for Sophie's Light, maybe in Boston where we grew up. Somewhere we can help women in the neighborhood where Mum struggled." "I think that's a beautiful idea," I said. "I'll help however I can." We walked in comfortable silence, watching our children play, and I thought about how success isn't measured in awards or recognition, or even in the number of lives your work touches. Success is this walking beside someone you once thought you'd lost forever, watching her children grow, knowing that the pain you survived together made you both into people capable of extraordinary kindness. We passed a bench near the water, the same one where my father and I used to sit with our hot chocolate. For just a moment I saw him there, not a ghost, exactly, but an impression, a sense of presence. He was smiling, looking at his daughters and grandchildren, and I knew with absolute certainty that he was proud. I lifted my hand into small wave and acknowledgement of the man who'd given me wings and taught me how to use them. Then I turned back to my sister and my niece and nephew, and we kept walking toward whatever came next. Maybe my family never truly saw who I was in those years when I needed them most. Maybe they saw their own fears and limitations reflected back at them and called it my failure. But for the first time in my life, I saw myself clearly. I saw a strong, kind, imperfect woman who'd been knocked down and got back up, who'd been betrayed and chose forgiveness, who'd lost everything and rebuilt it better than before. I saw someone who mattered not because the world said so, but because she decided she did. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with Stephanie's journey, from that humiliating moment at table 18 to standing on stage knowing her worth had never depended on anyone else's recognition. This story reminds us that sometimes the people who hurt us most aren't our enemies but the family members too afraid to see us clearly, and that real strength isn't about winning battles but about staying kind when the world tries to make you bitter. What resonated most with you in Stephanie's story? Was it the moment Richard recognised her at the gala, the devastating betrayal by her own sister, her mother's deathbed confession? Or perhaps that powerful realisation that she'd been hurting herself more than anyone else ever could? Drop a comment below and share which part of this journey hit you hardest, because your perspective matters and other listeners would love to hear what spoke to your heart. And here's something to think about as you go about your day. How many of us are sitting at our own version of Table 18 right now, letting other people's voices drown out our own? How many dreams have we buried because someone we loved told us we weren't enough? Stephanie's father said it best. Do what's right, no matter what anyone says. You don't need permission to matter. You don't need validation to pursue what sets your soul on fire. You just need to believe in yourself enough to start, and the courage comes later. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about forgiveness and second chances, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they're enough exactly as they are. And remember, your legacy isn't built in moments of triumph, but in the quiet, consistent choice to keep showing up, even when nobody's watching. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.